Yo, yo. Welcome to Web Dev
Hey.
Wednesday, y'all. Really excited for this show. For those who don't know, we mostly talk about like web centric stuff, things that would eventually appear on a website, but I've always been really passionate about mobile development and wanted to be more involved in the mobile dev conversation. Expo is an awesome project that makes it easier than ever before to deploy your React native apps, get them built, and send them to your users. And Charlie here is one of the founders of Expo. Want to give a quick intro to yourself and like do a better job than I did of explaining Expo?
Cool. Yeah. So I'm Charlie Cheever. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I went to Harvard. I worked at Amazon. I worked at Facebook. Then I started Quora. Then I took a little time off, and then I started working on Expo a couple of years ago. I've been actually at it for a while now. And what Expo is basically like I just tell you where it came from. It's just when I was working at Quora, one of the things I did was start and manage the mobile teams there. And it was such a painful process to build mobile apps, even ones just like built around websites, that after I left that, I was like, man, that was such a painful experience. All I'm interested in building now is mobile apps, but I like don't want to go through that experience. There's got to be a better way to do this. And then starting to research that with my friend James, and then eventually like making our way to Expo over, you know, as the output of our research and a bunch of work and things like that. What we basically do is like at a high level, we're always trying to say like when people have an idea and a dream in their head, how do we make that like come to life as quickly and as easily as possible and get it into the hands of their users, customers, whatever. And in practice, what we basically do now is we make a whole bunch of tools and libraries and online services that all like basically let people with like React web developer skills make like true native iOS and Android apps and also websites now from like a single React code base. And so we see people, who've never done any kind of mobile app development before, but who have some, web programming experience, some React experience, who can, literally build the first version of the product in a day or a weekend, and sometimes get it live within a week. Um, I can go into more detail about all of the things that Expo offers,
There's
but that's sort of a really high level view.
there's so much there I want to dig in on more first. Like uh, one of the things you touched on there that I absolutely love is how you didn't think of the problem, you had the problem. Like you wanted to build an app and run this small team, and the engineers needed tools that either needed to learn a whole bunch of new stuff and then hire more people to manage all these things, or you could build a solution that solves that better. And it's funny because to solve the problem you had at a small company, you almost ended up making a small company and then experiencing all those same problems directly. And I'm
Yeah.
curious how much you think that like there's almost like a cyclical nature here of you built this for the small team use case, then formed a small team and like started a thing and felt all those pains even more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's, even within the work that we've done at Expo, I think there's a handful of things that you could take and turn into another company, just like on their own. Like uh, there's a guy on our team named Will wrote something called like our entity framework, which is like one piece of the puzzle in this whole problem of like managing data and permissioning around it and like fetching from a database and writing it back to a database and whatnot. I mean, that's a whole sort of like half solved problem in building software right now. And we have one library that's pretty good that all the people on our team are like, oh, that's ever since Will built that library, I am so much more productive. And so I really think that you could take that and you could start building more stuff around it or whatever. But right now we're trying to help people build mobile apps and web apps. And so, maybe someone else will focus on that or we'll focus on that later or whatever. But I think anytime you do a bunch of work, you uncover a bunch. I mean, this is sort of the nature of probably anything, but definitely software startups.
Very good to hear. Trying to find the right way to ask this one. One of the experiences I had early with Expo that got me so excited was when I first actually signed up for an Expo account. I used my Twitch email because I was doing some experiments there, and almost immediately got an email. It was either from you or Evan. I'm pretty sure it was from you, and just wanted to like hear what we were using it for. And the speed at which y'all got involved in not just the work I was doing at Twitch, but the future projects I took on. You almost immediately opened a Slack room with me to chat and dive into the source and see the problems we had and how we were solving them. And that involvement felt unique. And like to this day, as many of these like other dev tool companies as I've worked with, I've never had one that got quite that involved at like the code level. I'm curious how you guys ended up there and how common a thing that is.
Yeah. I mean, so the way that that started was originally we had a pretty significant suite of desktop software because React Native actually needs a bunch of stuff to run. Like you need a particular version of Node, and you need you used to have this file watcher called Watchman installed properly. And then there were just like a bunch of things that had to be all installed. So we basically, like, one of the very first things that we did was sort of say, hey, it's a big pain in the butt for people to like go follow this long README document, install this piece, install this piece, install this piece. Let's kind of bundle all that stuff together into one download and make it work for people. And it turned out that like bundling desktop software and sending it to all kinds of people is really hard to get right. And so in our first like, handful, like when we were just this like super fledgling project, um, with like not very many users, maybe like 10 total users, a lot of like a lot of people would like run into issues because like partly because we had made a mistake, partly because they had some weird configuration on their machine. And so one thing I would do is just like whenever somebody would report that like in our Slack or just like open a GitHub issue, I'd often just say like, hey, like why don't we jump on a screen share? Let me take over your computer and let me figure out how to like I'll try to install everything the right way. And if a problem comes up, I'll like work through it on your machine. And we just kind of got in the habit of doing that repeatedly. And that kind of like and that was just out of necessity more than anything else. But then we tried to keep extending that because we found that like with anything where you're making like a library or a tool, you can run into this problem where you like get in your own head about what the thing ought to be, but lose sight of like the actual problems that people using it have. And so a couple things that were like really key um, for us in the early days were if we found a couple of people who are friends who are working on new products and convince them to kind of make a bet on our project. But our end of the bargain was that we would like be super responsive and help them and basically sort of like, be, you know, almost 24-hour on-call support for any questions they had about this. And like that really shaped our what we were working on and made it much, much better. Because like it was a way to like experience real world problems. But we sort of, we got in this habit of like opening up a shared Slack channel with people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that I've actually like we're trying to working on now is now that we've gotten a lot bigger, we can't have 30,000 Slack channels open with anybody. Um, but how do we like still get enough learnings and give enough support to like as many people as possible, um, instead of whereas like obviously like we still have some of this experience because we need some of that direct feedback from people and learning about what's cool. Like in your case, with Twitch, like I think seeing the Twitch name and just like everyone on our team knowing what that is and being excited about the prospect of that, like we jumped on that right away. But we can't do that with every little thing, but we sort of try to, and then we just sort of fall short in some ways. And so we have a Discord, we have a Canny that's sort of a voting board on feature requests and things like that. We have a forums, and uh, yeah, we're trying to keep up with everything there, and I'm trying to my current effort is to spend like about an hour a day on our Discord or forums, just making sure I'm like listening to what people are really having trouble with, what they're really running into.
That's so huge. And like, I can't emphasize enough how much that helps at every stage. Like, yeah, the company we're running, Ping, is super early, but I try to spend at least 4 hours a day talking to users, ideally in the product if possible, and as often as I can using the product to do content. Even now, like we're using Ping for this show. I couldn't imagine doing this any other way, and I couldn't imagine building something without that level of involvement with our users. It feels like impossible. Like, how do you know if you're doing the right thing if you're not
Yeah,
living so close to the users that they can comfortably tell you?
I agree. I mean, I think it's possible, but it's really hard to like to build products any other way.
Sorry, debugging some audio on my end. How are we sounding, everybody? Better? Much better? Cool. We'll take it. Anyways, yeah, I think it's so cool how involved Expo is. Honestly, I've kind of modeled a lot of our decisions around it, like opening up a channel with our users as soon as possible and having that direct feedback, like being involved in their process and like offering to help with their production, stuff like that helps so much. I'm curious, when you look at other companies in the tooling space, is that something that you guys learned and saw in others, or is it something that you did just because you needed it, or like where did that come from? And do you think others are doing this well?
Um, I think that like one place where that came from is like my first job was at Amazon. And in some ways, like not the most fun place to work as a developer. Like I think my eyesight is bad because I had a messed up monitor because it's companies that frugality is a value there, and so they just give you this super cheap equipment.
The desk's made out
And
of a door.
yeah, which are like extremely uncomfortable. I was always scraping my thighs against these like metal slats that were sticking out, like just sort of silly. Whereas like, and it's just but one thing that was really good, I thought, was like every time there was like an all hands or any sort of company wide function, like Jeff Bezos from would just like sort of hammer into everyone's heads, like our number one thing is we're trying to be the world's most customer centric company and customer focused. And you know, that wasn't like we're going to be the number one retailer online for books. We're not going to, it wasn't even like we're going to be the world's number one e-tailer. It was just like this relentless focus on like customer obsession, customer focus. Um, and I think that kind of stuck with me because I thought it was really powerful. And like, I noticed it making a difference in a lot of cases where like, I was a I was like the most junior person in the company and a lot of, maybe not like the most, but I was just like some random new kid. But even in just like little meetings that weren't really close to the leadership or anything, but just sort of like people would say, "Hey, wait, we have to figure out how to get these packages from this warehouse in Lexington to those customers who we promised it." And like just really like low level individuals just like going the extra mile to like live that value. And then when you get a critical mass of that happening and it just like echoing around and being repeatedly repeated by leadership, uh it really just like kind of built on itself and led to all these like really like things just getting done in good ways and people getting taken care of and good outcomes happening. um that I think is just really important. And also just like ends up making your product actually help people instead of being, some pure vision of what you imagined it ought to be before you started working on stuff.
I That makes a ton of sense. I really love the way that you frame that. I also came from an Amazon background. I didn't know we had that in common. And it makes a lot of sense that we both had the customer obsession beat into us early in our careers. And here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's dive more into the React Native world. I don't want us to spend too much time on the company stuff, as fun as it is. And I am curious, like, in terms of, I'm trying to remember how to put this on. This is a weird question because Expo is just so different from everything else in the space, where something like Vercel is for deploying your code, something like Remix is a new framework. Expo is a way to write your React Native app, it's a way to build your React Native app, it's a way to test your React Native app, it's a pile of packages for your React Native app. Like,
Yeah.
what is Expo? And in this evolving world of dev tools, how does it fit in?
Right. And I think like part of what makes it so hard to explain exactly what Expo is, it is all those different things. And that list is basically informed by like what was missing that people needed to like build something and be successful at it. And so when we actually started, we did a whole bunch of research, and we really wanted to take the web, like both James and I, the James Ide, my co-founder, we both had just worked on websites basically our whole lives. Um, and so when were looking at this problem, our first thought was like, maybe people miss something. Maybe there is a way to take like a web view and make a really like excellent feeling app out of that. Maybe that I could imagine that being true like sometime in the next decade with enough advancements and whatnot. But it's definitely just like we spent a lot of time confirming that it was not true when we first started researching this problem. And we finally just sort of got to the point where like there's nothing we can really do unless we're like on the Chrome team and the Safari team and can just like change the way the browser works in certain ways. And so one day we just sort of started saying, all right, let's just like start putting in some UI views in Xcode and push those, and then control those with JavaScript and push them around. And like immediately, like the first build I did of that felt so different and so good that like I just put it on my phone and showed it to James, and we were just like, this is immediately the direction we have to go. We ended up building a whole framework around this that was ended up being very, very similar to React Native right before React Native came out. And so we were actually kind of on the cusp of like, release. Like I think we went to a Node.js conference in San Francisco and just kind of started talking and we were sort of like, hey, we've got this project. Does anyone want to hear about it? We didn't like sign up to give a talk or anything. We were just sort of talking to developers and see if it would be interesting to people. And then like the next week, React Native got announced by Facebook and, immediately gets 25,000 stars overnight on GitHub and has all this momentum. And so we basically like looked at ourselves and we're like, look, they have 40 or 50 people working on this and we've got 2 people working on this. And they have so much like mind share and marketing momentum and whatnot. But we know that this is just like one library and the whole problem is really big. So let's just drop the stuff that we've been working on, take this open source stuff, and then fill in all the other gaps that are problems here. And I think for me, like a theme that just echoes throughout Expo's life is like the web is a pretty good way of doing development and is so powerful. Like, let's take everything that's good about the web and web development and bring that over and like un-F the mobile development space. And so like a key thing that we like started with was we basically were sort of like, let's build like a browser, like, because that's a great model. So the first version of Expo was really like designed to be a browser that you could just like browse other people's React Native projects. There were basically in the end 2 reasons we could not truly make Expo into a sort of a modern browser that's not a web browser, but the browser of the sort of like native content. The first one is just that Apple doesn't really want that to exist in the world. And so they basically told us like, hey, you need to make this not be a browser or we're going to take your app out of the App Store. And we really thought it was important to have like the Expo Go client be in the App Store just because that's like, I can give somebody a demo. I can be on a video call with someone and say, hey, do you have 90 seconds? Let me show you how you can be developing with Expo. Go to this URL on Snack, download this app on your phone, scan the QR code, bam, you're developing. And so that's really important that like the App Store distribution is a key part of any mobile thing being, almost any mobile thing being successful. And we needed that. And so that's just the reason. But then the other reason that it's really, really hard to build a good React Native browser right now is that React Native is like a library that isn't designed to be like the rendering engine for a browser. And like one thing that browsers need is this sort of like endless backwards compatibility. Like it's amazing and crazy that like I can take Chrome from today and open a website I made in high school in like 1997, and it still renders like basically exactly right. Whereas
I can't open a Swift app from last week and have it still work.
right, and it's one thing if they, and even the way the web breaks is more graceful, where it's like one thing that's broken about 1997 websites is if they have like the marquee tag or the blink tag or something. Those are sort of like officially gone from browsers, but it's not like the whole website breaks. Whereas the way that like something like a Swift app or React Native app or these things break is they just sort of say not compatible, barf, the whole thing blows up. And so like that just doesn't, and like actually one of the pain points still of doing React Native development, or this is true of Flutter development, basically everything. And I want to change this and make it more like the web, is that like we'll have people who I think this is especially true with Expo because we do make such a web-like experience that people who are like busy and doing a bunch of other stuff end up on our platform more often. Is we'll have people come to us and say, hey, like a big problem for me is that like I'm working on a whole bunch of different things at once. I'm running around getting customers. I'm, doing stuff on the web. I'm doing stuff with our back end, and the mobile thing is only one part of our whole overall experience. And so I only work on it once every 3 months, or sometimes I might leave it alone for 6 months. And when I go back, I often find everything sort of changed under my feet. And to continue to work on it, I need to actually like upgrade a bunch of things because I can't always even run stuff the way I'm used to running it. I have, and that's hard. Um, Whereas, you could have a website that's using jQuery and it's fine. Nobody's making you upgrade it. It's not like the modern thing to do. And if somebody was asking me, should I use jQuery for a new website? I'd be like, probably not. You should probably just use React like every other smart person. But it's like perfectly fine to continue using one in the old way. And one of the things that Expo offers now is this dev client experience where like we can build a binary that's like basically like an Expo Go client for your app with whatever binary code you need, which the most important thing about it is to let you use like kind of any third-party native library or code that you want, but it also means you can use older code. And so like the Expo Go client has the most recent React Native version and then like somewhere between like 4 to 6 versions before that. And so you can get, you know, somewhere between 6 months and 18 months of like compatibility spanned all while using the Expo Go client to develop stuff. But with a dev client, you could have something that's 3 years old and still be, not be dragged kicking and screaming to upgrade into the future. You can do it at your own pace.
There was so much interesting stuff here I want to dig into more. Obviously, like the backwards compatibility story and the thought of like incrementally adopting Expo into an existing app is super interesting. But I really want to go in on the browser thing. Like, I didn't know Expo started with like the goal of being a deeper browser. And that's so interesting. And like, pardon the spicy question, what do you think the future would have looked like if Apple didn't block you guys?
I mean, I think like if we had really done a good job and executed well, I think it's conceivable that like you could start that flywheel and get it going and like have a real like alternative browser that's not a web browser but is delivering the same kind of experience. I mean, you see this happening with um like you could almost frame like YouTube and Instagram and TikTok as sort of very specific kinds of browsers where like they let you browse like photo content or video content or whatever, but like over time they keep adding more and more features that like make them more and more like in Instagram now you can sort of add like a Shopify shop into your account if you have anything to sell. And the sort of end game of adding a million features to that is you have this sort of general purpose engine for delivering content to people. And so I think and I think there's also something where there's if you look at like the experiences you're able to deliver with React Native, where you're mostly sending out JavaScript and assets and stuff like that, not a lot of native code. Like you clearly, there's no theoretical technical reason you couldn't make a true browser for any kind of native app that's out there. Basically, I think there's some stuff where people do want to customize native stuff around the way video is delivered or those kind of things, but I think that it's likely we could have reached a point where we have most of the bases covered. Like in this, you see this on the desktop already, where like 10 years ago, video wasn't really standardized on browsers or was just becoming standardized, even though like Flash and sort of custom native runtimes and stuff were running ahead and delivering video and things like that before that. But nowadays, like almost anything you want to do on a desktop computer, you can do through the browser. Like Ping, for example. Right now, like I'm doing all kinds of stuff that traditionally you'd have to download a desktop app for. Like I'm, using the microphone, I'm using the camera, I'm like getting video streamed back to me. Stuff is happening in real time. And this is such a deep evolution from where the web started. You certainly could do this if you had, you know, a green space and your goal was to be more advanced in the browser, but you were committed to doing it. I think the problem is just uh, could you get enough people to adopt it? That'd be hard, but I think possible. Um, and but then like you need at least like, people to be neutral on the platform side instead of just wanting it to not happen. But maybe one day. I do think it would just be a better state of the world in the sense that like I sometimes talk about this like one of the sort of almost like I don't know if paradox is the right word, but it's like if you look at the world right now and how people use software, like most of the time, maybe not people like you and me who are like professional software developers or nerds or whatever, but normal people, probably 80+% of their time, they're on mobile devices or tablets or whatever using stuff in apps. Whereas if you think about like developer time, probably 90+% of like application developer time in aggregate is put into web stuff. And it's sort of like it doesn't make, whereas like, but and if you look at any popular product, even once it started on the web, like Yelp, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, all those things started off as pure websites before the iPhone even existed. All those things now are at like 80, 85+% mobile usage versus web usage. But then you go look at the downloads for like React DOM versus React Native, and it's like 10-1. And like that's just React. That's not even the whole web ecosystem. That's just like one part of it. And sure, there's other mobile stuff out there besides React Native. But I think, that this is true. You could look at Angular versus Flutter or something like that, and you'd see a similar ratio. And so I think that like part of what we want to do with Expo is basically kind of like correct that imbalance where it's like the level of effort put into like making these rich, good mobile experiences that are the kind of thing that people want to experience as users, that should be like lined up with where the developer time is going instead of kind of artificially like limited where the because of things like distribution and how hard it is to build and 20 other things all stacked on top of each other, we end up with people who are like, oh, I got to get this thing to my users really fast, and I need to be able to hire people to work on it. You end up building a website instead for one reason or another.
There was so much really good stuff in there. Like I could do a whole show about how Instagram is trying to rebuild the entire internet within their ecosystem, and it's fascinated me for a long time. But to go back to the beginning, one of the things you touched on, this idea of how every app like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, they are a browser in their own way. You're just browsing a specific type of content or storefront or things along those lines. What I've always found interesting is how Apple gatekeeps the idea of what is or isn't a browser. One of the like craziest cases I saw was when Apple blocked Microsoft from shipping the Xbox Cloud app on their platform because they saw the ability to stream a game as competing with an app store, but they saw the ability to stream a movie as an entirely separate thing. The act of interaction seemed to be the line where Apple drew, or the line Apple drew. Remote media that can be interacted with is blocked. Remote media that is purely consumed is allowed. And I feel like
Yeah.
that distinction is both arbitrary and harmful for the platform and like harmful for open platforms as a whole.
Yeah. And there's also all kinds of other complicated things like Roblox is another thing that maybe like is hard to fit into, like, why is that allowed if, this is allowed or isn't allowed? Um, and I do think that like there's some things that are pretty good about having Apple and Google have a lot of control over the mobile operating system platforms. Like some things just move much faster than they do. Like if like a downside of the web is like I was just talking about web video and how that, you know, was sort of semi-standardized like or something around 10 years ago. I can't remember the exact timeline. But like people wanted to do video on the web like since, 2000, and it was just like it just took a really long time for the web browser to actually get a standardized version of something that was good. And we had to rely on like Real Player and then Flash and then all these other things that were like, okay, but like sort of awkward plugins for a long time. Whereas if you look at things like fingerprint readers and whatnot, or face readers and stuff like that, like Apple and Google did a really good job of like baking those into the operating system and doing this, that. And I do think that like, there are ways that there are some nice things about that the app stores give you that like you don't quite get from a web browser and it's sort of full decentralization and whatnot. And so there are things that are good about that, but there's definitely a problem there where like if Apple and Google don't, but especially Apple is much more aggressive about this. If they just don't want you to do something because they have some other reason to think it's like strategically competitive with them, their rules basically say we can make up whatever the rules are and interpret them however we want if we want to. And so it's just going to be like they'll just decide whatever they want to decide. And I think that kind of uncertainty does make it harder to build as many foundational and big things. But it hasn't stopped everything completely in the sense that like over time, like you could probably look at Netflix and say, oh, well, this is like streaming remote media and there's some interactivity to it. Could they be taken down by Apple? Possibly. But a lot of people would be so cranky that it's really unlikely that they'll like pull the rug on them or something like that. And so over time, maybe you just build up confidence that something is okay and something that isn't okay. But yeah, I think it's one of the big problems holding that, like that sort of imbalance that I was describing, where there's just like not enough mobile developers compared to how much people want these mobile experiences. The distribution piece and the sort of capriciousness of the rules around app stores and whatnot is definitely a part of that. Or like
Yeah,
a pretty significant part of that.
there's another interesting piece there where like the interpretation of the rules was touched on a lot, and I think it's a really interesting idea. Like, from my experience, Google's blocks were more arbitrary and harder to understand. Apple's were more clear, like what the action was, but bullshit in what they expected from us, if that makes sense. Like, Apple had dumber asks, but they were clear. Google had more random asks that were much harder to like predict when they would come through and like get them to even acknowledge them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the other thing that's just like taking a step back from that whole thing, I actually think one of the most chill, like not chilling, like scary, but chilling in the sense of like slowing down the rate of progress type chilling effects in this whole thing is the way that it's like a ask for permission rather than ask for forgiveness model. Whereas, and it's not so much about making more stuff get through the cracks, but it's more like if I was teaching someone to make a website, the first thing I would try to do would be to get them to publish something like to the public web so they could send it to their sister or their friend or whatever and be like, check out what I made. Even though it just says hello world right now. Now all of a sudden I realize, like, I just realized that you saw that and that like you reacted to it. And so I mean like I can change that or whatever. And I think like it's really fascinating how like a lot of times I think when we see students trying to learn stuff with Expo and whatnot, getting something into the app store, they suddenly have this magic moment that's like, wow, I made a real app now. I'm not just like practicing or doing some sort of made up fake thing or whatever. And it just feels so much more real. And I think that's part, what part of the magic of what like these companies like Vercel and Netlify have done is make that really, really fast for the web where you can, start a GitHub repository, like literally write 14 lines of code or maybe even less, push it, bam, URL comes back to you in a couple of seconds and you can send that to anybody and they can see it live. And that's awesome. And it's really hard for us to do quite that magical of a instant turnaround for people with Expo because there's this step that's like, wait, maybe 2 days for Apple and Google to get back to you. And so they're just like, how do you speed up that process? One thing that we did, a really cool story that I heard that made me just, it was just like made me feel good about the progress we have made on that front at Expo, but shows how there's still a lot more room to grow. Is at the beginning of COVID, there's this company in the UK called Zoe Health, and they're basically like a big health technology company or whatever, and they just sort of wanted to do something about COVID because it was sort of the big health crisis in the world. And so what they came up with was that they thought, okay, we can make a symptom tracker in the same way that like Google flu trends was like pretty good about figuring out where like flu outbreaks were happening, and then you could kind of know where to be more careful or know where to send more resources. The idea was kind of like, hey, if we can get a whole bunch of people to report if they're having COVID-like symptoms, then we'll see where there's pockets of this stuff breaking out. And so even if not every single self-diagnosis of symptoms is like a perfectly accurate like diagnosis of COVID or not, if you get together a whole bunch of data and sort of look at it on a map, you can really start to tell something that's going on. And so they decided, okay, we'll build a symptom tracker. The thing was that they were like, okay, well, we're in this early stage of COVID. everything is changing week to week. Every day kind of matters. Also, the only way you're going to get a lot of people to do this is from their mobile phones, because that's just like the way normal people work these days. So we really want to build an app, but we only have a couple of web developers on staff. We don't have any mobile developers. So then you think about like, what do you do in that situation? Do you hire like somebody who does Swift development and somebody that does like, Kotlin development, and then go build two apps in parallel to some spec that you make? I mean, first of all, it's going to take you at least a month probably to hire a competent Swift developer if you're, starting from scratch. You don't already have a pipeline in place. Kotlin developer take about the same time, and then it'll take you months to build like an app like that, and to try to keep those in sync. That'd be really, really hard. But what they were able to do was their web team found Expo, was able to build like an MVP, like a super, super minimal thing in like 48 hours after they had this idea. And then they submitted it to the app stores, and they got it approved in about the next 72 hours. But during that time, they kept working on the app, and they were able to use the Expo update service. They can push out changes to your JavaScript without changing the binary, and sort of do continuous deployment over over the air. And so then by the time that like they'd launched a week after having the idea, they actually had a much more complete version of an app that was no longer the most minimal MVP, but like a pretty solid V1. And so then because they were a pretty big healthcare company that was connected to a bunch of media outlets and universities and stuff, they were able to get a lot of publicity around the launch. And they literally went from idea to having 1 million users on their apps and being deployed across iOS and Android in 1 week, just with a team of web developers who are now building sort of like native apps. And that was like a really cool story for me, just because we'd like compressed that time down. And so like this thing that like, not only would it be like nobody ever wants stuff to launch slower or be delayed or whatever. I mean, at least not usually. And it's usually just because of like cost reasons or things like that. But I mean, literally, this product wouldn't have made sense to launch if it was going to take 6 months or 9 months or something like that. It only made sense if they could do it in a time frame like that. And so that was exciting to me, just to see like more things will happen when you make these things just sort of like cheaper and faster.
Let's get into some spicy stuff, because you're triggering a rant. I've been waiting for the right time to go on. This is a conversation I've been having more and more. I have taken the spicy stance that for companies and products that could be using React Native, in particular with Expo, and choose not to, that's an irresponsible decision, not just because like React's the perfect technology or something like that, but because of the agility it offers around the very simple reality of like code push and Expo update. The fact that when I make a change, I fix a bug, if that doesn't touch the native layer, or not even, it can touch the native layer as long as it doesn't change the native layer, I can Expo publish locally, and my users get the latest version of the JavaScript bundle that is the majority of the app. The vast majority of the updates I've shipped in my life have been things that didn't require a native change. Why do I have to go through a 3 week, possibly even longer sometimes, review process to do a like tiny 2 line of code bug fix? That's
Yeah.
the reality of the app platforms. And if you're trying to build, or like, if you're trying to do something like what we just described there, imagine that app having a critical update getting blocked by Apple, or just taking too long to go through the review, when you could instead swap out the JavaScript bundle. It's irresponsible.
Yeah. I mean, this is another thing where you can like learn from the web. I remember when I was starting to work on Quora, um, I saw this. I actually was introduced to the idea of continuous deployment from there was sort of a moderately famous blog post from Eric Ries, who was like, I think he'd worked at IMView at the time. He's doing some other interesting stuff like long-term stock exchange, I think was the most recent thing he's been working on now. But he basically just like wrote this pretty popular blog post about continuous deployment. I was like, that makes a ton of sense. And so we just, from the very beginning of Quora, we set it up so that like you write tests for everything. If all the tests pass, whatever's in the master branch on Git, I guess it would be main now, but it was master back then, like just deploy it live to the website. And it's so good. Like there's all these little things that fall out of that you don't even like. Obviously the things that you're talking about are like the obvious benefits. Like there's a critical bug. Can we fix it today? Yes, we can. But then there's things where it's like, oh, like, hey, could we collect data about why people are getting stuck here? Like, could we, record more stuff here in our metrics? And it's like in a cycle where you have like a 2-week release cycle, it's like, oh, okay, yes, we will put that out, in the next 2-week cycle, which would be 10 days from now. Then we will collect the data, and then we can learn some stuff from it, and then we can make a change based on that. And so a month from now, you can have a change based on that. Whereas you can imagine if every commit is going out, maybe you put out some tracking and something in the morning, start getting results by lunchtime, realize what the problem is, push out a new change to your sign up form or whatever same day, and all of a sudden that month gets compressed down to like a single day and stuff like that. And so like there's all these sort of like knock-on effects of like speeding up this whole like system that are like sort of compoundingly powerful. And it's such a big deal. And like that, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like the more, and also it's just like people want to write their Expo apps mostly in JavaScript and TypeScript because that's what their developers know. It's easier, it's faster. But when you do that, it also has this benefit that yeah, you can change that on the fly. Like, and that makes a huge, huge benefit for people.
I've long preached it as the most undersold benefit, and it's one of those things that's so good once you have it that I'm going to need a lot of convincing to not have that. Like if I'm working on a mobile team, I want continuous deployment, or at the very least, the ability to run a terminal command to fix something that's broken in an emergency. Our app's quality shouldn't be blocked by Apple or Google. If you want them to be blocked by Apple or Google, you better have a damn good reason for it. And I find that that conversation point, like to start, works a lot better and also gets a lot of the bad faith out of the room that I tend to see in the React and Expo versus conversations. So if you're down, I'd love to
Yeah.
dive into that a bit. I know that
Yeah.
this is something you're painfully familiar with. I'm curious how often you still run into the but what about native conversation?
We actually like surprisingly little. I think that like there's a lot of times where this sort of change happens in the world where like around the time somewhere around 2008 or so, there's kind of a dividing line where startups that were started before then like have their own relationships with data centers and like run all their own servers and stuff like that. And they kind of like built up the muscles to do that. But then starting after around 2008, you had a whole bunch of people that just sort of like started trying AWS or whatever. And then were like, they never built the same kind of ops team. They just like kept going on AWS. And so there's like learn how to do things in this totally different way. And so there's a couple of companies out there that are just like been around a long time and have, like even Facebook who like built React Native, they're not gonna maybe not never, but like it'd be an insane amount of work and require a whole bunch of other things to like take their sort of big blue app and replace the entirety of it with React Native. They can do parts bit by bit because they developed technology and have a bunch of skill with it, but it's just such a big thing. And like, is the sort of core Uber app going to be rewritten in React Native? Like, it's just very risky, and they already have a bunch of iOS developers and a bunch of Android developers, and it's kind of working for them. So like, why would you like roll the dice with some big change that like might make you go faster in the future, but might have surprising downsides or something like that? Whereas new companies, like it's so hard to hire great people who can do Swift programming or Android programming. And so the only startups that I see that are doing that these days are basically ones started by people who have a bunch of experience building software that way. And those people and like that generation of people is sort of like dying out. Where like if you are a kid in college today, like there's a I've heard that I know there's a mobile development class at Stanford, and they use Expo basically to teach people to make mobile apps with, quickly, and start off
That's
as a
really
student
cool.
initiative.
Sorry to like
Start
interrupt
off
on
as
that,
like a
but I'm so used to
student.
university programs that like use tech from 14 plus years ago. It's just I'm
Right.
geeking out knowing that they're using something that new.
Yeah, well, I think that's just like a credit to Stanford that it's like one of the most cutting edge universities out there, and it's in this heart of Silicon Valley and connected industry and whatnot. But it's even in this case, it still started off as like a student led course, so it was sort of like a half real course or whatever. But somebody told me that this year the enrollment there in that course is higher than the one in the iPhone programming class. that like taught, how everybody learned Objective-C back in the day was like these free videos of the Stanford iPhone program class. And so, I mean, it makes sense. Like why, you know, it's, if you wanted to just like be able to build an app fast, like this is just a faster technology. It'll get you to your result faster. And so I think like fewer and fewer startups are going to have like, oh, a co-founder randomly did a whole bunch of iOS at this company or that company before, or learned it in school. And so it's just pretty rare that we see, I think much more commonly, it's just like people choosing, like either they have some sort of like clunky thing that was built using web views before that they're redoing, or they didn't have a mobile app. And Expo is sort of the, like, it's pretty common that it's like our choice was not Expo versus another thing. It was only have a website and just say we can't afford to do a mobile app for now, or use Expo and that actually makes it fast enough and cheap enough to do, because we can take our web developers and they can build an app with Expo. Like that's almost the number one comparison that we get, is sort of like Expo or choice to not do it.
I That makes a lot of sense. And I, like one of the questions I had was Expo versus native or Expo versus no app, and you totally answered that one. But I do want to push back slightly on when should an Uber adopt React Native into their existing app. I have a very strong like Uber specifically probably shouldn't. They have an existing app and an existing team and are mostly an application like mobile platform. But something like one I talk a lot about, Twitch. I firmly believe Twitch should adopt React Native, not because they have a native team that's bad or because the state of the app or even like the update thing that I'm pushing for, which would be huge for something like Twitch, simply because mobile's the one platform that product teams can't hit directly. So if you're on the chat team at Twitch, or you're on the safety team at Twitch, or you're on the music team at Twitch, if you want to make a native change to the mobile apps, you can't. You can change anything else on any other platform at the company: mobile web, core web, back end, front end, the native apps on desktop through the Electron layers. But on mobile, you cannot own your product as a product team unless you hire specific talent. And I see more and more companies moving in this direction, where rather than having teams around specific technologies or specific like repositories, they have teams around specific projects and products inside of the company. And it's almost like a company like Amazon or Twitch is a bunch of mini startups. And Expo and React Native would allow those startups to not be required to hire two mobile engineers, one for iOS and one Android, for every single one of them.
Right. And I think that's a much better way to organize if you can. And one of the dilemmas of doing mobile development for, basically like 2009 through probably, 17, 18, 19, 20, was basically like, do you organize yourself by product or whatever, but then, can you get somebody to do iOS and Android and keep all of Swift and all of Kotlin and all the, but not even just like those languages, but the APIs on the iOS platform and the Android platform, like all in their head all at once. Not that's just really, that's a lot for an individual to stretch for. So then you end up needing to hire these separate people, but then you're frustrated because you do want to organize yourself by product, because that's how like somebody designing something and building something for users actually thinking about things. And it just sucks to, pay this coordination cost of keeping your iOS dev in sync with your Android dev. So I do think that like one of the key things that React Native, or, this is probably true of Flutter to an extent too, gives you is just like this ability to organize yourself in a way that much more closely aligns with the way that like every non-engineer in your organization and all of your users think about your products.
Totally agree. It frustrates me when technology decisions are made in a way to are made more around the people who have the most experience with the technology rather than what is the best for the company or product. And I feel like the native conversation for mobile is often plagued with this.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that make I mean, some of these are just sort of in the weeds technical points, but I think they're actually kind of important. So when I think about like, you talk about somebody like Uber moving to React Native, there's a couple things you can do and a couple of things you can run into. One is like, I've heard, I'm not 100% sure, but I've heard that Uber Eats is actually written in React Native.
I'm almost
And
positive
so
it
like a
is.
lot of times companies want to make like what?
I'm almost
You're
positive that
positive
Uber
it
Eats
is.
is React Native.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's it's not even actually has to 100%. The point can still stand even if it's not true, but I think it is. That like one way that you can get a new technology like this into a company is like the next product and the next product are built with it without having to like do this sort of conversion of a bunch of legacy code and like change the legacy organization or whatever. And that and you can kind of see like that happens enough times, and then you eventually end up with like most of the stuff that your company offers being in something like React Native. And that's probably like the most organic, low activation costs, smoothest way to do something like that. Some of the like if you did try to say, hey, we have a big binary app that has 100 iOS engineers and 100 Android engineers working on it, like there's a couple challenges there. Like just to compare to web, like one of the reasons React is so popular, and one of the ways the story I hear a lot about React is like, oh, our startup was using, Knockout JS or whatever, and then some new person came into our company, and was their first task was to like do something on the settings page, just add a field or whatever to let somebody turn this off or that off, and they basically just like wanted to use React for it, and so they just added React to that page, and they used it for this one corner of the page, and it didn't add too much weight, and it just like didn't bother anybody, so it's fine. And then somebody else was like, oh, that's actually quite nice, and so then half of the settings page is now written in React, and then a month later now the whole settings page has been rewritten in React, and then all of a sudden now the profile page is too, and then 6 months later we're doing a conversion where like the whole engineering team has now gotten on board with like converting the whole website page by page. But it sort of can be this very incremental thing where you get buy-in at each step, and at each step you're kind of like proving that it can work and it's not going to cause problems. And then it can also interoperate really well. Whereas like there's a bunch of challenges when you introduce React Native into a code base, like, and you can kind of see how it can go wrong. Like one of the things that I think was pretty bad for React Native overall was like Airbnb for a long time was like hyped as like the flagship outside of Facebook adopter of React Native. And like they had engineers talking at every conference about how they were doing stuff and all those other kind of things. And then one day, I think maybe 2018 or something, there's sort of blog post appears. It's like why we were dropping React Native from our whole stack or whatever. And I think a lot of it was just sort of in the way like an organ transplant can go wrong if it like, even if there's nothing wrong with the organ, like the host body might just sort of reject it. I think that was just sort of part of it was just like an organizational thing, or it was like there's these two groups of people now who are working on stuff, and like there's sort of ways that these layers have to interact, and like there's chafing there, and et cetera, et cetera. But then another part, like when you start getting into the weeds of the technical stuff, there's actually some pretty good reasons that aren't even really about personality or politics or anything like that. Where like just think about like client side state management. If you're writing a React Native app, you're going to do most of that in JavaScript. Like you might use Redux, you might use like XState or MobX or any of these, or there's a bunch of other things out there as well. But you're going to, end of the day, you're basically using JavaScript variables to like store the state of your application. And you're probably doing some smart caching so that when you fetch stuff from your API, whether it's GraphQL or REST or whatever, you're not refetching the same data all the time if you don't need it, and you're like keeping stuff around and keeping it organized in a reasonable way. But then if you think about like if you write a Swift app, you're not using Java, like you don't have a JavaScript interpreter, and I mean, you might set one up or whatever, but like you don't necessarily have a JavaScript interpreter. You're going to use like Swift data structures to store everything. And so then if you're going to, if you think about, oh, I'm fetching Theo's profile picture and I'm doing it from Swift, and I'm storing like the URL of that and other metadata about it, et cetera, in these Swift data structures. Oh, but now I'm in a React Native screen, some other part of this app. How do I get access to that stuff? Do you make some sort of layer that goes back and forth between your React Native app and your Swift layer that like shares that data? That's a huge amount of overhead and like a huge amount of cognitive load to think about. Or do you just like refetch the data separately and keep two copies of it? Now your app's taking up more RAM and it's slower, and like there's all these other things. And so like there's just ways that like React Native and native don't like completely interoperate as much as at least, and they can be made to. And I think people will invent libraries and solutions that make this smoother and smoother and smoother over time. And I think actually probably most stuff will end up in, as apps move more and more to stuff like React Native, the data will move mostly into JavaScript, or into like really specialized libraries that are managed by JavaScript. But like, and this problem will slowly sort of fade away. But that's just like one example of things where like it actually is like a bit harder to do this sort of brown field or hybrid solution where you're writing a bunch of native and mixing it with React Native. That's like much harder compared to the way that you introduce React on the web, where you're still using the same programming language, you're still sharing all of the same memory and data structures and whatnot, and can kind of bounce between the two worlds very easily and transparently. Where it's much more complicated and not, maybe I don't want to overstate the complexity, but it's definitely more of a hassle.
Wait, JavaScript for state? I thought that everybody was moving to SQLite for mobile state. Did you hear about Facebook with Messenger?
Well, I mean, this is like, I think people will figure out really good techniques and sort of standardize them, and that like stuff like that will likely be like, maybe that's the foundation of it.
SQL is a
I
state
mean,
machine.
yeah, possibly. I mean, SQLite's very fast and very good at that for like that kind of thing.
And SQL is a universal functional programming language, so
Yeah,
technically speaking.
so it's not completely crazy.
Yeah, this is a really interesting framing of like I guess I don't really think enough about the data story when I think about mobile because I'm usually like when I think about React Native on mobile, I'm thinking about how excited I am to take the working like state solutions from web to mobile. Like I can copy paste the hooks directory I have in most of my projects that manages all the hooks for our
Yeah,
like API calls, paste that into a React Native app and it's good to go. If I feel like sitting there and like bashing my head against Lerna for a few weeks, then I can eventually get those in the same repo with like the native app, the like web app, and a shared
yeah,
package that has those hooks. With that said, I am really curious in a world where we're all moving to these full stack solutions like Remix, Next.js, and
yeah.
like providers like Vercel, Netlify that are trying to like solve problems top to bottom. Where does Expo fit there? Like, what's Expo's relationship with the back end and a full stack app? And how are you guys
Yeah.
thinking of that as you continue iterating on
I
Expo?
think, especially the last year or so, I've been thinking about it a lot more. But I think like the first step of that is really like when we started working on Expo, we really thought about like, hey, people have two problems when they're making an app. They have an Android problem and an iOS problem. If we can collapse those two problems down into one problem, just like the make the app problem, that's a huge savings. But then the further we got into it, it's like, no, that's not quite right. People actually have three or like three and a half problems. They have iOS and Android and web. And like, if you can collapse your iOS and Android in one, that's great. But a lot of the same challenges that you were describing about like separating out people by technology and how that is an organizational sort of necessity sometimes, but sort of like handicap in others. It's like you don't actually want to have like a separate web team from your sort of native app team when your products that you're trying to build are the same. Like if you think about the way products have evolved, like if you go to Instagram.com on your mobile device, it's essentially pixel for pixel, a very close clone of the mobile app. I'm pretty sure it's a totally separate code base written by totally separate people, but they're like looking at the same design mockups in Figma or Photoshop or whatever, and they're being sort of given their sort of assignment is basically like clone this thing. And that's sort of silly. Like, why wouldn't you just want all these product implementations in sync across every platform? You're going to have fewer, missing features, fewer things to explain in your support docs. You're going to have fewer inconsistencies or fewer weird things hitting your API because one version is lagging behind the others. Like you just want all these things to move in sync, don't you? And so we have more work to do here to make this as good as we want it to be, but we're really excited about what we're seeing in terms of how many people are basically going out and saying we're going to build something using React and using iOS, Android, and web all from a single code base. Not trying to do like something with Lerna or multiple or Yarn workspaces where we're trying to like have two repos that share a couple of libraries, but just really go the whole way. And I think that like the technology is pretty close to just being there. There's just a handful of things that to make it like feel nice and not feel like, oh, I really am making a lot of sacrifices because I'm using like Expo Web or React Native Web instead of like React DOM. I mean, it also you can get really good results. Like, like the origin of React Native Web is this guy Nicholas Gallagher was working at Twitter and was sort of tasked his team was tasked with like making the mobile website better and faster. And he just liked a lot of the architecture on React Native. And so he's like, even though we're not going to make an app, let's just build a, I'm going to make a library called React Native Web that will let us like write our web app and using React Native's paradigm. And that's how we're going to build this website. It turned out pretty great. It's fast, it's responsive, people like it. I guess the metrics must have been good because they basically took their main website and replaced it with the code base from their mobile website. And so like, this top 20 website in the world is built this way, and it's quite good. And so, yeah, you could build basically any website that way. There's, the navigation stack is a huge thing here where like the navigation of mobile apps is different than in the browser. We have a URL bar and a back button and stuff. But, I think if we think about each one of these problems and come up with good solutions and help people with all those problems, I think the standard should become that you build for every platform from a single code base, I think. And that's like one of the things we're looking forward to. We're not as staffed up on it as we'd like right now. But that's something heavily on my mind.
My next question was, when are you guys hiring Fernando then?
Well, Fernando is like building his own. I mean, he's like the CTO of a startup. And actually, going back to sort of the beginning of our conversation, I mean, obviously, like we'd love to have Fernando on our team. He's an awesome dude. And I've told him that. But at the same time, it's pretty great for us that he's out there like building a real thing with our technology, because we learn so much from people like him that are pushing the limits and just like being thoughtful about it. And so whenever he tells us something about like, hey, this isn't that good, or like, what about this? Like, it's really, really legit. And like, without people building real stuff on we'd end up with these blind spots of like, oh, well, like we thought we did a good enough job here, but no one's actually really used it. And so can you actually build something that good with this, or whatnot? And so, yeah, there's a bunch of people out there who I like, on the one hand, love to work with. On the other hand, I'm like happy they're building stuff with Expo, outside of Expo, because it's like an ecosystem and it needs those people.
Totally agree. I definitely feel a lot of that at even Ping, where we have some of the coolest users imaginable that are doing awesome stuff with the product that in the future I would love to hire. But right now we need them and their feedback more than we need them as a potential like employee. And if they help us get to that point, then in 5 years, it makes so much sense to snag them
Yeah.
and like work along those lines. I will say that the promise of write once, run anywhere is something I have always been a little concerned about, especially with the unique types of applications I tend to build. Something like Ping that we're in right now, building
Yeah.
a platform agnostic WebRTC and device management layer that could be reused between the web app and the mobile app is a much bigger ask than building two decent UIs and two slightly different projects that share a ton of like the data and state management.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think that there's a couple of things that like you can do to mitigate that. And one is, I think, like a very high level, at a very high level, being practical, or maybe pragmatic's the right word here, about it, instead of like zealously committed to fully single code base. What I mean by that is just sort of saying like, it's perfectly fine to say, hey, I'm going to have a switch statement here that says, if I'm on Android, do this. If I'm on iOS, do this. If I'm on web, do this, and handle stuff a little bit differently in those cases. And like, instead of thinking that that's like a blight on your code base that like somehow has to be ironed out and everything has to be pulled back into these abstractions that like solve everything, and for all devices, even theoretical ones that aren't existing yet, that you just sort of say like, hey, like, let's just make this work for us right now. And even at a screen level as well, like just some saying like, hey, there's some really cool stuff we can do here if we use the latest APIs on the latest iPhone, and we want to put this on the screen here, but it's just not going to work on web, or it won't work until September on Android because that's when this is dropping or whatever. And so like just being willing to just say, hey, yeah, we'll get a lot of benefit if we try to make the whole thing like a single code base. But then where that just doesn't work, we can just say, hey, do this different thing, different thing, different thing. Yeah. And then on I also think though that like a huge part of why you want to build a different interface is partly just about like screen size and screen ratio and whatnot. And like, desktop, it's just more like landscape, it's usually bigger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are other differences as well, like like you can like one thing that I learned pretty quickly when I started working a lot more on mobile is like you have incredible precision with a mouse. Like people can really hit like a 2 or 3 pixel area with like a lot of reliability with a mouse. Whereas when you're like sticking your fat thumb on a phone, it's really, really hard to hit like a small target with any precision, especially because people are also like walking around with their devices and like fumbling in their hand and whatever. And so just you just want slightly different res. But when you think about web, so much of the web usage has actually moved away from desktop to mobile web that like so many of these design principles in terms of screen layout and like what kind of interactions you want, et cetera, you actually want them to be more mobile like instead of what we traditionally think of as web like from our experience sitting on our computers 10 years ago before the web really worked quite well on mobile phones.
Interesting. I definitely discredit the switch statements like platform a little too much. Like I ugh, this is like very strong bias because of the type of stuff I build, but the thought of like mounting a different call component with its own entirely different like device management layer feels like I'm losing like the problems that we're spending our time solving are not the platform problem. And I think that there are really compelling ways to share the hard parts and also solve the hard problems that aren't necessarily starting with the same code base. All of these things are mono repos, and I'm a really like increasingly bigger proponent of mono repos. I love a future where like we have our backend in TRPC that exports a React package that both our front end and our backend can use. Oh wow, I'm getting follow botted right now. That's fun. Finally big enough for things like that to happen. Rad. If any of my mods
Yeah.
are around and want to figure out how to deal with that, I'd appreciate it. No worries. I'll bug somebody at Twitch later if I have to. Yeah, this is insanity. Well, anyways, I think that the vast majority of applications being developed right now absolutely would be able to do like one code base for everything. I think every code base will eventually be able to do one mono repo with the hard logic, the state management, and the problems
Yeah.
with complex interfaces being shared across the things that consume them, and things like sharing the logic for how your chat is managed or who's in the call. Those are the problems I really want to share the code for and not have engineers rethinking. I'm okay with an engineer having to rebuild the JSX for two different platforms, much more so than I am them rewriting the state machine.
That makes sense to me. I think, and I think that you're probably right that like the one platform everywhere, there's probably some set of things that end up with just like mono repos of different web versus mobile things. But I think that you'll be surprised by how many things are able to get to a state where pretty much everything is just like one code base. Because I think once you flip the idea on its head, and sort of the default is to start with like single code base runs everywhere, then I think you end up in this where if you have to come up with not a reason to like force that to work, but instead you're like, this is just how I work. And then wherever this breaks down, then I break out of it. I think a lot of things will actually just work fine under that paradigm. And there's just some tipping point on the road ahead of us where people like get this idea that like I probably can for most things just have a single code base everywhere. And then once people start like when they're starting a new project, when they're setting up their directory structure and things like that, they just sort of start down that path of sort of single code base. I think that things will just like stay that way for the most part.
That much I definitely agree with. My one big concern there would be the exit story. I am always concerned whenever I adopt something new, like what does moving off this look like? It's the reason I
Yeah.
don't really recommend solutions like FaunaDB, not because it's like a technically inferior solution, just because if I change my mind and I built into this thing that's not SQL, moving off of that is incredibly difficult. Whereas if I use a SQL provider like PlanetScale, I can move to something else. My concern with like React Native for web and building on top of an abstraction of web is you're now abstracted in a layer that's a lot harder to replace. You either have to like own that layer
Yeah.
or rebuild the things on top of it. And that's a huge risk to take on versus like sharing your state management solution is a lot different from sharing your root.
Yeah. I think that that's a really reasonable point. I think that one thing I would say that makes me pretty that I really like about React Native web, and just it's more a thing about React, maybe anything else, is that like React Native web is actually a very thin abstraction in a lot of ways, in the sense that like if you write like a view in a React Native app and then run that through Expo Web, React Native Web, or whatever, you're gonna get a div basically. Like it's not like some sort of crazy transform compared to the way a lot of other things do it, where they'll sort of say, "Oh, we have something in WASM that is like a complete renderer that handles every pixel on the screen, and we have this other runtime, and that's outputting this UI, and then we're using our sort of custom renderer to like draw everything in a canvas or a WebGL context or something like that." It's kind of like, whoa, okay, like that's a real like now we're like in a totally different system. Whereas like you can take something that's like built with React Web and it could like live in the same page as something else that's written in React or not even using React and just sort of interoperate because there's not a lot, it's like a very thin layer in certain ways, and the transforms and whatever are they're pretty straightforward and intuitive.
It's like there's multiple places where abstractions can occur. They can occur in like the development layer, in the build layer, and in the like runtime client layer. Something like Flutter, where you described here, is with the canvas on client. That abstraction is at the client layer. The runtime is fully abstracted away from the way that the browser normally does things. The abstraction for React Native, especially React Native for web, lives a little higher where it's still calling and doing the native stuff. Your solution and like the renders are still occurring in native land for whatever platform, but you're still committing to the abstraction on top of that in a way where the code becomes less reusable. And like I I'm being harsh not because I think this is like a huge flaw that's going to prevent React
Yeah,
Native from taking over the world or Expo. This is more I want
yeah,
to be very clear. I
no,
can't and am very unlikely to reconsider like or I can't move our architecture at Ping as much as I would love to be a React
yeah.
Native
So
first
here's what I
company.
would say about
It's
that.
such a huge risk for the way we're building to buy into an abstraction that high when like there is very little that we are using right now that I'm committed to in that way, and I
Yeah,
need a happy story out.
right. And I think here's what I would sort of say about that. Like, um, if you look at like if you talk to people like working at a startup, for example, like I remember s- we at one point we used auth0 for auth at Expo, and it just kind of broke. Like they just like lost a bunch of our data about our users, and it was just down for 3 days, and nobody could log into Expo, and it was just like a nightmare. And so then like so we eventually moved off it, obviously after that, because it's just something that's too critical. It can't go down like that. You can't just lose user accounts. Um, and I think as we were talking to the team, it was kind of like, how could we have trusted such critical stuff like our user data to like a third party service provider? And then it's like, it's so good that we've moved it now into our own stuff. But really, our own stuff just meant it was like on Google Cloud and AWS, which isn't really our own stuff. It's just that we like trust Google Cloud and AWS because they've been around and they're support and like they're enough other people are using them and it's reliable. And you just sort of like at a certain point you'd get to the point where you're like, okay, that's like safe and it works. And I don't need like you don't even sort of think of it as like a third party or a thing that you're like locked into as much. And part of it is like, if Amazon's not working for you, you can move to Google Cloud or you can move to your own whatever. And there's some portability there. But it's part of it is just that you like stop thinking of it as an abstraction or a layer when you start to just sort of say, okay, that's going to be fine. Like I'm not like worried about being locked into it as much.
Interesting. I like this like I'm thinking of Expo the way I think about Express. You're thinking about Expo the way that you think about AWS. And I think that makes a ton of sense and is a really good way of putting it. I like Expo is a lot more than a framework you're adopting and a way of building a website. It's a way of orchestrating an application's development. And as such, building it in a way where every part's replaceable just doesn't get you where you're trying to go.
Yeah. At the same time, though, I do think that that's like one thing we've learned over and over and over again is like developers have all these different ideas about how they want to do things, and they're going to do them, or they're going to be really upset, or they're not going to be able to do them, and they're going to be even more upset. And so like you just have to like if you kind of track work we've done over the last like 3 years or so, so much of it is basically sort of saying, hey, wait, people might want to do something weird and different here that we didn't expect. We need to give them a very smooth way to do that. And so like um originally, like a lot of the way Expo was built was like kind of started from this browser idea that we had. Um, but then as we've become much more developer focused and just helping developers do stuff, like you can see the like Expo is much closer to like the bare metal of, I mean, it's a ridiculous term for this, but like, you know, of sort of React Native. Like there's not like people used to ask, like, should I use Expo or React Native? And now the answer is sort of like there isn't really like a difference, because you can use kind of any part of Expo with any of like modern Expo stuff with like you just any kind of React Native project, and you just add the parts you want to use. And it's not like there's no sort of hard fork in the road where you have to sort of choose something in a big way. And so just like accommodating more flexibility as developers' needs change, or as you just encounter a developer with an unusual use case or an unusual situation. Um, I think that like I would bet that any company working on developer tools or similar products is just repeatedly encountering like, oh yeah, we need to just keep adding more flexibility and more portability and more ability for people to customize and integrate with whatever they want to integrate with.
Very interesting. I really like that way of thinking about it. One of my favorite things when I'm like trying to pitch the React Native ecosystem in Expo to like another developer or team is I'll have them scroll through the packages directory in the Expo GitHub repo to see like how many pieces are there for you to consume. And I really like that framing with Expo. And one of my favorite like changes Expo made was with EAS when they stopped, or when y'all stopped using the Expo client with every native package anyone might need, and started shipping
Yeah.
the thin client that builds in whatever your package
Yeah.
JSON includes. And it's almost like you allowed developers to build the best custom browser for them in their use case,
Yeah.
and gave the plugins needed for us to hook in and out of that directly.
Yeah. And I think that you'll see us continue to move in that direction, where it's just like, um, help, like, don't just make assumptions about what people need or want, like build what they need, and just like assume that there's going to be total beginners that just need stuff to work quickly, but there's also advanced people that like care about all the little details being exactly a certain way, and you need to support people across that whole spectrum. And yeah.
Are these things at odds in any way? I'm trying to find the right way to frame it. Like, when given an issue, do you find yourself almost asking, like, does this solution, or we would use this solution, but can we? Because it might hurt this other user on the other side this way. Like something that
Yeah, I
makes
mean,
things easier, but might make more advanced use cases harder. Something that makes advanced use cases easier, that makes React Native for web a harder target.
we never really think about making React Native Web a harder target, because we're still in the process of like kind of getting to 100% parity there, and we kind of know we don't want to slow down the progress of everything else just to sort of give React Native Web a chance to catch up. Like we want to make sure that it's catching up because it's catching up to where people want to be, not because we've slowed anything down. So we don't really do anything that way. There are times where um, like if you think about something like Expo camera, like a big theme of what I see people doing is like they want to do a lot more multimedia stuff. Like Ping is a great example of this, where it's like a web app and like a mobile app or whatever in certain ways, but it's also like it's leaning heavily on camera, microphone, other kinds of stuff. And so like, and if you think about like a lot of what's popular, like what are the most popular apps to come out on mobile recently, like TikTok, probably the most recent gigantic thing. What's popular before that? Like Clubhouse got really popular in pandemic times. And like these are just, all of them seem to lean on multimedia a lot. And so one thing we could do is like put a lot of energy into making our multimedia stuff really, really, really good. But until we have a chance to make like Expo Camera and Expo AV like handle everything that you possibly might want to do, kind of where the web APIs have finally gotten to on desktop, or at least like are approaching, maybe sort of asymptotically, but like they're not fully there yet.
They're pretty close if you're willing to lock out every browser other than Chrome, which we were actually forced to do. Fun fact,
Yeah.
the 60 FPS video mode, memory leaks and crashes Firefox every time. If you're receiving a 60 FPS video over Firefox's WebRTC implementation, your Firefox instance will crash.
Yeah, and I think like that's kind of, I was sort of talking about how like part of what is a little bit good about the sort of duopoly in mobile operating systems, you do have these like, instead of a huge list of browser vendors, it's just like you have these two, and they're a little bit more free to kind of like go ahead in a way that like in practice the web is basically this now, because it's sort of like Chrome and Safari and then Firefox playing catch up. But it's not like there's even like, Edge is really just like essentially like kind of a Chrome based thing at this point. And there isn't really as much competition anymore. But in stuff that's new, yeah, like you don't get the standardization as much. But anyway, yeah, multimedia is really important. But in mobile, like we have to think about like, do we want to try to like give everyone this camera thing, or do we want to empower people to, use whatever video module and video recording module and streaming module, etc., that they want? And in the fullness of time, we basically want, the answer is both. We want to have an amazing set of multimedia primitives that covers basically everything. But also, if you wanted to, do your own thing with your own binary code or whatever, you can do that very easily as well. It just sort of, for us, we're a pretty small company still. So like we have to pick and choose a little bit on like what things that we want to get done in terms of like, I've just been talking about how I want to make all these advancements on web, but any person working on that is maybe not working on making the Expo camera module the best, or not working on making sure that it's even easier than it is now to add in your own native code and get that compiled and back to your device or to your friend's device or your coworker's device as quickly as possible. So in sort of a theoretical point, I don't think there's that much tension, but from a like resources and like what can we get done today and this year and this sort of quarter, there's more tension there just in terms of priorities.
That makes a ton of sense. It's a slightly weird tangent, but I think it's similar enough. I'm curious how you think of Expo's role in the ecosystem in terms of like what y'all should be working on. I know that Expo contributed heavily to like React Native unimodules and directly to React Native in order to make some of these technologies happen. Like, what's the relationship like with React Native itself right now? And like, it was like on the other side of the relationship with your community, like who's contributing where, and how do you think about that at Expo?
Yeah, I mean, it's always changing because like we, James, my co-founder, and I both in the past worked at Facebook. And so James knew a lot of the people on the React team. And so, and the React Native team. So we actually had a pretty tight relationship with a lot of the people working on it in the early days. And those people have turned over a lot now. And so actually I see Eli White, who runs a lot of the React Native stuff at Facebook. Like every couple of weeks, we play Ultimate Frisbee, and so we just will usually talk a little bit after that and sort of stay in sync. And we have a bunch of different channels open with people at Meta, and obviously people out in the community. We work really closely with Software Mansion in Poland, who has developed a bunch of great libraries like around screens and reanimated, and has helped us with all like we work. Some of their people are like essentially on our team at this point. And obviously we have a relationship with like Infinite Red and Callstack and all these other sort of big name groups in the space. And I think everybody, one thing that's great about developer communities is mostly people are sort of not thinking like cutthroat competitively, but like there's a whole lot of stuff to get done here. Let's all try to help each other and then help the whole ecosystem. And so it's pretty good. I do think that like one thing that is um, one thing that's interesting about the React Native ecosystem that's it's one of those things that's good and bad is that the number one goal of the React Native project at like inside Meta Facebook or whatever is basically to help Meta Facebook build software for themselves. The really good thing about this is that they have some of the biggest applications in the world and they have a ton of good engineers and like they're like so they make it work. Part of the reasons it's like quite good are that they've like had to make it that good to be able to like be accepted inside that organization and meet the standards that they want it to meet. And like you can see like they care about performance on low end Android a lot more than a lot of people do. And like if some sort of random group that just only had MacBooks and iPhones was working about on this project and not even testing on low end Androids, there'd be a lot of ways that this would be a lot worse of a project and stuff like that. The flip side is though, is that it's not really like a super high priority for them to like get to like have it solve every problem for every kind of other developer out there. Like they don't really care about, you know, Ping or whoever, like whatever startup to have that much success with React Native. They sort of do in a roundabout way where it's like, oh, if there's a whole bunch of React Native engineers, that's great. If they come onto our team, they'll be more experienced and they can ramp up faster at building our next thing. And it's just good for our brand to have our successful open source project out in the world. But those are pretty sort of like second or third order, like they're just not like top priorities the way. And part of this, Meta Facebook doesn't have like a developer business the way that like if you look at the resources that Google is putting into Flutter, a huge part of that is they actually have this business built around Google Cloud and Firebase and these kinds of things. And Flutter, you can kind of, and like they have other, I think they're trying to, use Fuchsia as the foundation for, a lot of their sort of hardware devices and potentially, maybe the future of mobile phones and whatnot. And the Flutter is also the US. So they have other strategic reasons as well, but they actually have a developer business. So it makes sense for them to hire a ton of DevRels and advocates and people to just like make content around this stuff and make sure that it works for people and that like, upgrading between versions is smooth, even if you're outside. Whereas like at, Facebook, they're more like, is this working for Instagram? Is this working for the Facebook marketplace? Is this working for the next product that we have? Are those teams that we just met with on our campus satisfied? Rather than like, our job isn't to solve problems for so and so in Austin, Texas, making some menus app for restaurants or whatever. It's actually kind of funny. Oh, I was just gonna say like the the weaknesses of React Native are often either in the parts that like no product at Facebook cares about, or that are the most important at Facebook because like if you think like a good example of this is sort of like there's still room for improvement with some of the uh, sort of long lists of sort of feed like things, and it's kind of like the feeds for Instagram and Facebook or whatever are not written in React Native because those are too important and too valuable and just like too connected to their ad revenue and engagement and all their top line metrics. So they just like can't roll the dice like re-rolling them into React Native. Whereas like, for most people out there developing React Native apps, they're using, the list views that we have that are not bad, but like they aren't just like amazing in the way that like if Facebook was definitely like using those things for their main apps, there would just be this incredible amount of performance work going into all kinds of edge cases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I know Discord had to put a lot of effort in to try and get the list view to a point where they could be using it for chat across platforms. And
right, I think over time, like people like Discord using it and pushing it and just making and like people trying new ideas and different libraries and stuff, like it'll just keep getting better. And I think the community will solve this problem. But I was just sort of pointing out as like a funny sort of good and the bad of the way that the project is sort of positioned inside Facebook.
yeah, I think the interesting part of this framing is how Meta positions things in a way where it does what it needs to for them and it lets the community fill in what it doesn't. I think React itself did this phenomenally well. It was a way to turn state into DOM with the component architecture as simple as possible. It had no opinion about styles. It had no opinion about package management. It had no opinion about build. It had no opinion about animation or transitions or even like state management beyond re-rendering like randomly. Slowly they added like the necessary missing parts to make it more adoptable, but they never really invested in things that are kind of table stakes now, like the back end to front end story or like animation layers
Yeah.
and transitions and CSS and all these things that we see in Svelte and we see in Angular, we see in Quick and Marco. I think Meta's approach here is very different from others in the industry for various reasons. But what's most interesting to me is how it's resulted not just in like libraries forming like React Query or Material UI, but more importantly, like companies forming around what the technology
Yeah.
doesn't do to make it more adoptable for people that aren't Facebook. Like I would argue Vercel is very much this. They are taking the things React doesn't do and solving them so well that you can now distribute React globally and as easy as possible. I think what you guys are doing with React Native is very similar.
Yeah. There's definitely something where like by leaving the space open, it creates sort of this oxygen that allows like an ecosystem to form of people who like ambitiously go after a problem, in a way that like if Facebook did have a big developer to business, they might just say, hey, we'll just take care of all this. And with amazing execution, maybe that leads to like all these problems being solved in a super coherent, awesome way. But that's really, really, really hard. And so more likely it probably ends up with like a bunch of okay things that are sort of half baked and whatever. I also think a really nice thing about it is it lets companies exist that are really focused on the developer and not some being like one thing that I think is a little bit tricky about the um, some of the ecosystems we see in the development world is there's these big platform players, and a lot of what they do is like sort of strategic for them rather than like them trying to help you. And I don't mean that there's any like malice there, just more just like if you think like, you know, Xcode being free, like they're not trying to like sell a product to developers that like people buy because it's such a good experience or whatever. They're like, we want people to make iPhone apps and Mac apps in a certain way, and they need a way to do it. So we're making this piece of software for them, and it needs to meet our other strategic needs. But like nobody pays us for it, so like it's just sort of like when you work with like Apple tools or even Google tools or whatever, you're not like you're not like a customer of theirs who's like use like I guess you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, this is a really interesting like who's the customer I hadn't thought about here. Like Meta or arguably even Google, like the reasons they're building these things are serving specific purposes for themselves.
Yeah,
And the reason I would be much more interested in something Meta does than Google is because Meta's going to solve one problem they have and let us build solutions around it. And like I'm not Meta's customer. I'm a developer trying to ship to an
right.
increasingly like growing number of users. Meta doesn't care about me and my needs. What's interesting is they built their technology in a way where people who do care, people like y'all at Expo, people like Vercel, like Netlify, like all these other companies, even like Remix Forming, they do care about me and my problems as a developer and a
Yeah,
CEO of a small company. And it's cool that React was built in a way where you caring can make up for Facebook not caring.
yeah, and in some ways it's like it's actually very helpful when they're like, yeah, we don't really like. It's very clear that they like don't care. Whereas I think we talked a little when Flutter was sort of first got its sort of 1.0 and started to get a lot of attention and momentum. We spent some time looking at like, hey, some of our stuff we could probably apply, like some of our libraries, we could make them work with Flutter if that makes sense, blah blah. We could maybe try to do, a lot of people get value from our over-the-air update solution. Could we apply that to Flutter? And Google basically was like, we're not really interested with working with anyone because we have a bunch of people on our team who want to solve these problems. I don't think they like word for word said that, but like we basically like they just like didn't really want an ecosystem of people outside of Google like filling in this space. They had their own ambitions to kind of eat it all themselves.
Absolutely. We are getting pretty close to time. I want to open things up for questions. I've seen a bunch of cool ones in chat, and I want to make sure people can have an opportunity to ask more. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you were hoping to, Charlie?
No, it was covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, there was a lot of really cool stuff in this conversation. I'm excited for the VOD to go up too. Start dropping more questions, y'all, in chat. One I saw, I just want to make sure I get it before I forget. Somebody asked if you'll be attending App.js Conf.
Of course. A bunch of people, I will be there. I'm speaking there. A bunch of other people from our team will be there. Brent will be there. Evan Bacon will be there. Those are probably two of the more well-known personalities from our team.
That'll be a really cool set. Love all those
super
guys.
stoked about it.
Yeah. Somebody asked, will Expo React Native eventually target desktop native? They mentioned something like an Electron app, but we can go into why it won't be like Electron.
Definitely, like, philosophically, we're 100% on board with that. Like, I want single code base that targets every platform that you want to be. So, like, I would love to target PlayStation eventually and everything like that. But like practically in the very short term, like right now, we do Android and iOS really well, and we're working on getting web up to that speed. And it's pretty usable right now, but it's not quite on par with them. And those, I think, are the biggest three things. And we don't hear as much demand for desktop stuff. I do think that if you're using web and it works, it's very easy to make an Electron version that targets, basically every desktop platform, and it's pretty good. I would love to go like full desktop native with that stuff. Getting easier and easier now that like the iOS and Mac OS APIs are sort of converging even more. And as Microsoft kind of embraces React Native for Windows, it's like a thing they're really supporting and whatnot. So I think that's part of the long-term plan, but we're not going to announce anything anytime soon that's like, hey, here it comes, like first class desktop support for native Mac and Windows stuff. We just don't have the resources to work on it yet, but really want to one day.
I'm very excited for that future. I have a tiny bit of experience with React Native for Xbox, funny enough, because it's like a Windows platform and Microsoft like kind of blessed it. And it's really cool seeing like React code running on things you would never expect. Another one that was mind-blowing for me was React Free Fiber. I know you guys had some WebGL and 3JS support for a bit, which was cool. And being able to write and read React code that renders a 3D box and transforms it, and having use state interact with a 3D layer, like seeing this like bridge like created between native application layers and React is still like mind-blowing, even though it's been going for a bit.
Yeah, it's cool.
One other fun one. This is a very Theo question. What's the story for patch packaging and Expo package?
I'm not the best person to answer this. I think
worries.
like one thing that we've been looking into is like putting better support for PNPM in place. I, for a long time, have thought that the sort of way that like NPM and stuff do these node modules folders seems a little bit wasteful, and especially with multiple products on your device. And there is a good amount of momentum behind PNPM. The downside of that is it does make patching individual packages harder. I don't even know if I'm answering the right question here, but like,
No, you are.
Like in some sense, like if you just go into the node modules folder of something and change it, that should get picked up by the bundler once it realizes there's a change. You might have to reset. I don't know if you'll have to restart the bundler or whatnot. And I know there's a patch package on NPM that I've used in some projects, mostly node backend projects, but I imagine you could sort of repeatedly patch your node modules folder in some sort of specific way programmatically, and it should work theoretically, but I've never really done this.
It's such an interesting, the reason I like asked the question is I'm actually really interested because of like the power of like React Native unimodules and the thought of like writing a patch package in NPM land that modifies a pod file or modifies like native code and then would be picked up and built
So
correctly in like
what you should look
EAS.
at is Evan Bacon and some people on our team wrote this thing called config plugins that basically like is kind of a programmatic way to do this. So like basically just sort of like makes it much easier to take a native package and then have it make whatever changes it needs to your config files, your pod files, or other things in your XC project, things like that. And so pretty common now that a lot of third-party React Native module authors will use this config plugin stuff to make installing this into an Expo project or a React Native project they're using with EAS build kind of like a one command thing instead of a one command and then follow the rest of the page of instructions on the README.
I still
And
remember the amount
so
of weird Kotlin I had to write in order to get like the first
yeah,
dev build of the Expo dev client working. It was fine. And it was like real early, like early 2020. And I didn't know that I was like in an alpha 6 months before it would be announced. But it's really cool watching
right.
how these things evolve.
No, like, but we don't. It just is not reasonable to ask like most people out there to deal with that. And so just getting it down to like I have the thought that I want to add this stuff. Okay, now the developer of that library has done the sort of work to say, okay, modify this file so it can go into place and whatnot. But yeah, Expo config plugins is basically like the main answer to that.
Really
If you're
excited
interested.
about the Expo like update and config future where I don't have to even open Xcode. We're getting closer and closer there. I still
Yeah,
have to open it occasionally, but
I am really. I mean, I don't like opening Xcode in Studio, not because they're like bad pieces of software. They're just big and fat, and like I don't want to have to keep one open for each platform. I want to move a lot of that stuff to the cloud. I like think that. I mean, almost everything else, you just see it happening more. I mean, my friend Suhail is working on this thing, Mighty, that's like moves your browser to the cloud, where it's just like everything running on your local device. Are just it can be underpowered, things can go wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so just like moving, like, and Xcode it needs updates all the time. It can get messed up in certain ways. And so if we can create a world where people just don't need, I mean, another thing is like outside of the Bay Area, Macs aren't dominant. And so like a lot of places in the world, early on, we had a lot of people in like Southeast Asia who were using Expo. And we sort of tried to find out why. And a big part of it was like, it's really hard and expensive to get your hand on a Mac there. People want to make iPhone apps. And so this was like one of the only ways that they could make an iPhone app without that. And so we want to make it to the point where like any develop, even if you want to do native code, you should be able to do that without having Xcode in your computer, where like you're just sort of using our EAS cloud service to build everything for you. And we can get you eventually like really high powered hardware so that like, you don't need a high powered computer. You can use a Windows computer, a Linux computer, or even like a laptop or a tablet or something that isn't even really like a computer in the sense that we think of a computer, even though it's sort of obviously theoretically is equivalent. And like just be using or build a whole Expo app inside a web browser without having to like this is actually a very common thing where we built this snack thing to sort of let people play around and experiment, report bugs, demo things to each other. But a lot of people like they learn to make stuff that way, but they don't actually know how to use the command line. They don't know how to use Git or whatever. And so, but they would love to be able to push a button there, have it kick off a build in the EAS build, then push another button, submit that build to the App Store, get it live in the App Store, all from code they're writing in their web browser. And there's no reason that can't happen. We just need to put in the work to do it.
I'm so excited for us to be there. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know it's getting a bit late and you've stayed for like well over an hour and a half now. Any last thoughts or things you want to chat about before we wrap up?
I think that just like the biggest thing is like we've done a ton of work over the last 2 years, basically like saying, hey, we need to push out the ceiling of what people can do with Expo. We aren't satisfied with this just being something that people make simple apps or prototypes with or start on and then graduate off of. We want this to be like something that you can make the best things in the world with. And so we need to just like make it work better for people who have like care all about all the details of their native code and whatnot. And so I think if you have this sort of, if you haven't really used Expo for something serious, definitely check out, like we've added this EAS build product that they'll do building in the cloud. And also means that like all these things where it's like you were sort of mentioning how the old way Expo worked was builds would include every native module in our standard library of packages. So that would lead to like a pretty big binary size, and you don't always need that. And so ES build sort of the minimum size thing required and whatnot. And then it can also add in, whatever native libraries you want, every third-party stuff. And then you can do development using this Expo dev client. It's gaining popularity every week, but it's still like a pretty small percentage of our users even know about it or use it. So if you're like wanting to develop an app and it has native code, you should use the Expo dev client. And then we're kind of in the process of rolling out our new EAS update thing, which is just over the air updates, but our sort of second version of it that's much more robust and powerful than our sort of and just more fully featured than our classic update service that we've had for a while now. So those things I think really like are worth checking out if you haven't looked at Expo in the last 6 months or so.
I will say, having been really deep on Expo last year and having almost no opportunity to touch it this year until about a week ago, the difference is substantial. Being able to EAS build in terminal and have a native like build environment spin up and make your app for you correctly and let you scan a QR code and get back to work was surreal. And I'm so excited for a future where that works for everyone.
We're gonna keep pushing them, but like I'll often like sit with like I'll do this for the team every couple of weeks. I haven't done this actually in a month or two. I should do it again, where I'll just like say, all right, I'm gonna build a really basic application with a stopwatch next to me, and I'm gonna record how long it takes to get from this step to this step to this step, because every second of your time matters especially when you're starting a project and maybe you only have 15 minutes before your lunch break's over, or maybe you're just gonna run out of energy to do it, or just get distracted by your boyfriend watching TV or whatever. And like it's just so important to make that smooth and fast and take out complexity and take out time and waiting. So we're just trying to ratchet that down so you can get done what you want to get done as quickly as possible and just get it to your customers as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good note to end on. Any last things you want to shout out before we wrap up?
Just App.js conference, June 8th through 10th in Krakow, Poland, hosted by Software Mansion, and Expo team will be there. And thank you so much for having us on, or me on. It was great. It was really fun. Thanks, Theo.
I've wanted to have you on forever, and I'm so pumped we finally could. If you're not already following Charlie on Twitter and Twitch, I am sharing that link now for Twitter at the very least. See Cheever on Twitter. The chat or links in chat now. Make sure you give him a follow if you haven't already. I'm gonna keep hanging out a little bit after, but I'm gonna switch over to the BRB and wrap things up. Thank you guys again so much for coming by. Thanks again, Charlie, for stopping by.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
I'll be back in like a minute. I want to go refill my water and like get my laptop ready for some streaming. But yeah, give me like 45 seconds, 2 minutes. Be right back. What is good? We are back. How y'all doing? That was a fun one. Any big takeaways? I saw somebody in chat saying that they actually want to start using Expo on a side project. Always can come up with a new one, as Keysor said there. I really want to shout out everybody who subbed, but I actually can't see the list now because of fucking the follow botting destroying all of my notifications. I have no easy way. When I do the filter, it only shows the gift that Glassy very generously gave to Mir earlier. Thank you for that, by the way. I would have done that gift later, but I appreciate you immensely. Yeah, I can't see shit, and it sucks. I want to shout out all y'all for being so generous and dope, and people botting on Twitch prevents me from it. Oh, wait, I found a way to maybe get this info. Oh, yes, Stream Elements has actual access to it. Cool. I can also turn on chat and notifications again. I had those hidden. I forgot about that. Cool. Now I'm going to get chat messages again, which I should have the whole time. So, yeah. Shout out Cedric for subscribing before the show. Super appreciated. Alex is very real as well. Atrika, Kodex. Oh, can I just like replay all of these? I can. So, gonna start replaying alerts for the people who didn't get them. Is this working? This isn't working. That's annoying. Never mind. I can't replay them all. But yeah, shout out to Soundwave, Captain Strider, Ghost AN, Kodex, Atricia, Alex is very real, Cedric, obviously Jason for being a sub forever, Alejo, Maple just now. Thank you so much. I have no idea why those still aren't coming up. If I transition with it visible, will it? My overlay should be working now. Get out of studio mode. There we go. Now the sub or notifications are coming through. No idea why that was so delayed. Yay. And thank you for the Prime Maple. Thank you for the Prime Witch Skull. Y'all are the best. I hope that you guys enjoy the sub-only chat where I'm literally just like posting source code from Ping. I think that there are going to be some really cool conversations in the sub channels, and I do plan on like hanging out in the sub-only voice chat soon. So be ready for that. If you do have a Prime that you haven't burned yet, make sure you do that. If you have an Amazon Prime account and you haven't linked it to your Twitch already, you have a free sub sitting there that you could give to me for putting all the effort into this content. And right now you're not. Go fix that. Really appreciate it. Now these are all coming through like all at once with crazy delay. Interesting. What works, works. Still can't believe I got a fucking like 1,000 follower bot earlier. That's like beyond frustrating. I've never seen that before. Sorry, I'm also seeing a ton of like customer calls and things that I missed. Ugh. Ugh. Yo, Keysor, thank you for the sub. We have a hype train going now. That's dope. Thank you guys thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the food money. That will be spent well. I need to update my stream title and shit. We're not doing React Native stuff anymore. Talking. What are we gonna talk about? What should we talk about? Anything fun going on? I know that there's the what's it called? Remix Conf is going on right now. Is that live? Can we watch that? Can I commentate live on Remix Conf? It is not live right now. Interesting. It seems like it was live earlier. Any really good talks at Remix Conf that are worth us talking about? Ooh, the Fly Machine stuff's cool. The Planet Scale stuff's cool. Planet Scale Connect's a little lame, but Remix Conf ended yesterday. I was so sure it was still going on today. My bad if it wasn't. I thought, no, it absolutely was. I saw like it was live on Twitch today. Or not Twitch, on YouTube. I'm almost positive I saw that React Native, or that a Remix was live on YouTube today. I could be wrong, but I hope I'm not like mentally blending days at this point. I'm sleeping enough. I think I'm sleeping enough. Pretty sure I'm sleeping enough. I think I saved some things on Twitter. Did I? Bookmarks for stream. Planet scale portals. Did I talk about? No, I wouldn't have because that just got announced. Yeah, let's get my screen share working. 1 sec. In case you didn't know this about me, my setup's a little needlessly complicated. I do this to myself, but oh, cool. That's never worked first try since I started streaming. I normally sit there and try and get my screen capture working for like 20 minutes, and this time it just worked. I just realized I haven't closed anything, so let me switch scenes while I do that part. Don't want all my shit open. Terminal open is fine. Chrome. Oh, do I owe you guys cats? I totally owe you guys cats. Are the two of them fighting behind me? Yeah. There's a battle. I wish I could zoom, but this lens is not a zoom lens. Sadly. That actually explains a lot. Just figuring out where the maids put my trackpad. Ugh. Cool. Yay. I now have my usual setup again. Oh, the fight's still going. Can I at least angle it like down slightly? Nope, that would fuck up my camera a ton. You know what I'll do? I will film it and post it in the sub-only channel. So if you want to see the cats fight, that's the place to do it. Hey, bud, be cute for the camera. You're making me money. Come on, be cuter. No, you just want out? Grr. I'm gonna let him out quick. 1 sec. No more cats. I still have to come up with a new title for the stream. Someone come up with a good meme title for me. What are people talking about right now in JavaScript land that I can like grab onto? X Twitch staff complains about JavaScript. Accurate enough. Cool. That might get some attention. Just wanted a title that's clickable. Next.js ripped off remix. That's my YouTube, man. I should clickbait on Twitch more, but yeah. Anyways, let's make sure my DMs aren't open. Wrong button, and they totally are open. Don't want to spoil any fun things coming up right now. Bookmarks for stream. Full screen. And here we are, my usual setup. Start with planet scale portals. This is an interesting one. For those that don't know, planet scale is introducing the idea of read-only regions, which means that your database, instead of being fully located in one place, will now be multi-region. Not for writes. Like if you can't write in multiple places, a write still has to go to your main place, but reads can be replicated in other regions so that you have a really performant, like low latency way to fetch data closer to you when you're like requesting data. It's a really cool change. Why does it seem like it's always daylight in my room? I have a real setup. Anyways, introducing planet scale read-only portals. Some of the numbers they posted in here are super cool. Where is... They had a latency example in here. There's somewhere. Cool, yeah. For an application deployed to Frankfurt, talking to a Northern Virginia database can add nearly an extra 90 milliseconds per query on a query that's otherwise like 3 milliseconds. And it's insane. Some of our like latency, since we're all based out of one region in US West 2, this doesn't how do I put it? This allows us to have a much more performant like experience in our server because we can co-locate the read on the server to data that's way closer to it. It reduces the distance between the place where the data is being fetched, which is the server in this case, and the database itself. The catch here is it's read only, which means most of what I think matters, which is the cache and the read experience, getting the fastest, like contentful experience as possible, is better. However, we need the tools that we use to interface with our SQL to catch up. Right now, something like Prisma, for example, has no way to select multiple databases or multiple database URLs for different types of uses. There's no way to say for reads, use one of these 4 URLs, but for writes, use this one URL. I know that Prisma and PlanetScale are working relatively closely, and it's pretty likely that they'll fix this in the future, but it sucks that this is one of the first times where I felt like the choice of PlanetScale and the choice of Prisma, as cool as both are and as much as both are innovating, a lot of the innovations I see from both are things I can't consume because of the slight at-odds nature of the two things. It's dumb stuff like I have no use for the MongoDB support in Prisma because we're using SQL, but it's also kind of frustrating stuff like I can't use like update actions or foreign keys in Prisma properly in PlanetScale. I can't do like update or like on delete cascade type stuff in Prisma. And on the PlanetScale side, I can't use these new read-only regions because Prisma is the only way we connect to our database. So awesome. So excited for how we'll be able to use this in the future. Not going to be very useful for a bit. To the question Big Sexy asked, isn't that what GraphQL helps with, creating a schema that manages different data sources? Kind of. GraphQL is an API. It's not a replacement for SQL in the sense that you abstract SQL through GraphQL. It's more a different way to define your API. So it's a layer deeper. If we Excalibur this early? We're Excalibur this early. Who am I kidding? Cool. So if we Excalibur this out quick, don't need a new collection. I have a stream. They redid the UI here a bit. It's kind of nice. Cool. So we have a spectrum here from database to user. And the database, this is where like PlanetScale is. And then the user is your browser. Somewhere in here you have an API. And this API can be a server. It can be serverless through something like Vercel and Lambdas. It can be pretty much anything. But this point here, GraphQL lives here. This is like Swagger, Open API, REST. Those are kind of the same thing, whatever, GraphQL. This is where that lives. What we're talking about right now is a step that's between these, which is the database connection. I guess we can call this ORM. As much as I hate the term, this is effectively an ORM. Let's move this down a bit so we have more room. And this ORM layer, this is things like Prisma. What are some other popular ones? What's the Rust or the Rails one? Active Record. Stuff like this is how you connect to your database, and then the database itself, like MySQL. I'll just do SQL. Doc stores. Mongoose is a Mongo ORM, yes. Yeah. So this is like the different layers to an extent. Your API uses something like an ORM or just direct SQL calls to connect to your database. GraphQL doesn't replace anything here. There are a few people who have tried making like a GraphQL type ways to connect to your database directly, or even go as far as storing your data in a graph structure using GraphQL as the method. They're lunatics. They're wrong. Ignore them. They're just not worth paying attention to. Trust me on that. Don't need to go deeper. It's chaos over there. Like GraphQL wasn't built for that. Don't use it for that. Cool. Seems like their primary example is Rails. They claim you can do it with other things, but none of the things I use can do this yet. So not super useful. But yeah, very excited for this and the types of cool things it's going to enable in the future. Should be a very exciting like opportunity to like significantly improve performance on our web apps that are accessing data. What were the other things? Did I save anything else? More use effect stuff that I was angry about. I don't think any of that's super like worth jumping into. I did see it looked like Bolt shut down. Did that happen? Is that a real thing? Oh, Bolt layoffs. So they're still around. I was concerned they like actually shut down right after Fasted, but nope. Yeah. I'm excited for him to blame YC for this. Yeah. Any other big news in the last few days? I know I like just did all of the news on Monday, so there hopefully isn't too much, but can always be wrong. There was the Fly.io stuff. Still one of the coolest domains ever. API for fast booting VMs. Yeah, this was really interesting. The general idea with Fly.io's new stuff is that you can spin up a VM almost instantaneously. Their goal is to like, as I say here, like our VMs with a fast REST API that can boot instances in about 300 milliseconds. It's pretty insane. Did React Router v6 have like actual news? React Router. Is it out? What's the... There a blog post somewhere? I need to read this one for a bit. I have it in my like read later and have not gotten to it. Doesn't look like there's an easy like what's new in v6 to find. There's an upgrade story here. I'm happy that they wrote this and this took priority over almost anything else. But man, upgrade to React 16.8. I forgot that 16.8 was when hooks were added. It's crazy to think that like people are running that still. Damn. Main concepts, React Router. Somebody has a link for me. I'm down to watch from that. Any good new content? Anything I can like shamelessly like leech content from and just react to? Can react to my own reactions. We could build an Expo thing quick. That could be fun. Yeah, fuck it. Want to build an app? Let's pick something to build. More Chris Hawks. Yeah. I could complain about that one, or about a few tweets. I'm still... I have to say, guys, I love my community. The first time I have been disappointed in my community was y'all saying you don't like semicolons. It wasn't many of you. The vast majority of you are on the right side of history here. But like, come on. Your opinion is valid, Maple, but you're still wrong. And that's okay. Still love y'all. Just know that like this is the first rocky ground we've been on. And I trust you all individually to reconsider what you've done here and remind you that semicolons are there for a reason. It's to let you know the line's actually over. They're good. Use them. It's like the weirdest thing to drop. Also, spicier version of this take. Y'all want to see? Let's just go to GitHub. This is the easiest way. Want to see the prettier RC for ping? Oh, we don't have one because I use all of the defaults in prettier. They're fine. Don't let people have stronger opinions than the people who encode the opinions. We use the prettier defaults because they're totally fine. The default pretty RC has things I don't like in it, and it has behaviors I don't enjoy, but I choose to accept them because by using the default, we don't have to argue about it. There's no decision to be made anymore. Lack of trailing commas. That's the one that kills me. Yeah, that's. I am tempted to file an upstream pull request just to start the conversation. Trailing commas should not just be on, but mandated. It's that's the one that always hurts me, and it hurts. It cuts deep. I don't want to do that, but fuck. Yeah. What if they remove semis from the default? I'm gonna have to reconsider a lot of things. Losing both semis and like trailing commas in the default of prettier, like not having trailing commas is like 6 to 7 out of 10. I'm angry about it. Not having semicolons would be closer to like 8 to 9 out of 10 angry. I think that might push me over the edge, but like right now, we install the package, use its defaults, and nobody's complained. I really like that. And I don't want that to become an argument when right now it's not. I'm doing a new stream title. I'm very curious how you guys feel about this one. The most risque I've went. Got to really keep the brand of the best dressed and best looking engineer on the platform. Putting the semi and semicolon. Anyways, what else is there to talk about? What was the other thing I quote tweeted because I was angry about it? Ooh, Maple found the update. Not much. Yeah, we can pull this up. Why not? Easier for me to do it this way. Oh, that is not where I'm trying to go. Remix. Run. Scroll a little bit. May 23rd might be a bit far. I don't have an easy way to get a link from my desktop to my laptop at the moment. Here we are. React Router v6.4.0 pre-2 is out. Not much there. Oh, release notes. Here we go. Remixing React Router. We'll start here. I don't dig Storybook. It's important. I hate it, and I avoid it whenever I can. Function loader. This isn't type safe, is it? Please tell me that, like, on client side, where you actually have a theoretically type safe story for these loaders, if one of these loaders was like not a server function, it was a client function that did some async shit, like fetching your like devices from device picker. Please, for the love of fucking God, tell me that if I was to await window dot like navigator dot get media devices here, that there is some way that doesn't involve some jank type inference and export bullshit that lets me take the type definition from what I'm doing here and have access to that here. I wish that the remix guys could learn like how the type safe story is changing. The most telling one for me, and I hate to like kick a dead horse, but there's a really nasty back and forth between Alex, the creator of TRPC, and Kent, where Kent basically asserted that there's no way to have type safety over the wire because you don't know for sure that the thing you're getting on either side is the thing that you're expecting. And if you have a client that's out of date from the server, you might have written that with a typed contract that's now out of date. TRPC solves this relatively trivially by having Zod as the validator on primarily server side, because the client getting malformatted data is like an error you can resolve when your like version's out of sync, or you can validate on client if you really want to, but it's entirely optional. Generally, it's the server side validation, making sure that you have a meaningful representation of what the server expects and that you're honoring that when you call it. That's where most of the fragile bullshit tends to happen. And TRPC solved that incredibly well. And I don't have a single like non-type safe call from or between our backend and front end in our app because we have validation on every one of those calls. Yeah, let me I feel bad because like Kent walked this back a bit, but let's see. Yeah, this is a long one. Don't use TypeScript generics that are just there to lie to you. Only through the use of type guards and assertion functions, runtime checks, can you truly have end-to-end type checks across I/O boundaries. There's a middle ground between lying to you and returning any. I/O bound should be modeled. Yeah, surprise, surprise, I heavily agree with Dax here. Bet you $100 I can make both of them have runtime type errors. And this one devolved quick. See where I'm pretty sure that we had Alex jump in here somewhere here. Yeah. Dude, TRPC forces you to have a runtime checker before you do some silly interfaces or inference of the types. The inference comes from the library. Zada's first class support, and additionally, the first POC for TRPC was created by Colin Hacks. Yeah. Yeah. This one was really frustrating because, like, it showed that there's a core philosophy from the Remix team, which is that type safety over bounds is a lie. So we're going to not solve that problem at all. And when people prove that you can make parts of this a lot better and you can make something that feels like, and honestly, in most ways is a type safe story from back to front, you can't call Zod cheating. You can't call us solving the problem cheating because it's outside of your way of framing these things. We have succeeded in solving this problem for ourselves, and Remix makes it harder more than it makes it easier. And it's disappointing that there are even people in the Remix community working to solve these problems, and this is the response from up top. Yeah, I really wish Remix could embrace the the push the community's having, rather than, I feel bad putting it this way, it almost feels like they're segmenting the community around people who need something to migrate create React app off of, rather than people who are going to push hard to get it improved and challenge the like foundation that Remix is built on. It's like there's a fundamental difference from when I'm like tearing apart the new Next.js RFC, and I have Lee and team just hanging out in chat, and these types of like subtweets on Twitter. The difference there is stark, and it's frustrating because there's a lot of really good tech in Remix that I really want to see the community push and the founders of Remix push too. But they'd rather subtweet than solve problems sometimes, and that's incredibly frustrating to me. And it's also arguably inappropriate that I'm talking shit because I'm not contributing to open source meaningfully at all right now. I'm just shit posting on Twitch and running a company, taking full advantage of all of these technologies and using them to make myself very successful in other spaces. But man, I can still be disappointed, and I am. I honestly am. Like, I learned a lot of what I know from old Kent Dodd's tutorials, and I don't want to feel like he's talking down to us for solving the problems that are important to us. And it's really frustrating how often I feel that way. I'm sure this clip's going to get to him, but yeah. Thank you, Master. I appreciate that. I really hope that, like, even if I'm not writing code for open source projects regularly, that there are going to be downstream impacts of the advocacy I'm doing, I guess is the right word. But like the things I talk about and the amount I care, I know it's infectious in a way. And it's exciting to see like financial contributions going to Alex and going to TRPC that start from people that I arguably introduced to TRPC and might not have found it otherwise, and seeing like a community forming around that technology that I don't want to say like I'm the reason for it, but I definitely kickstarted the growth pretty early, and now we're at a dope place. Oh shit, Spec. Oh shit. Yo, Spectissa, what's good? Good to have you here. I hope I don't scare away your Weeb audience with our like technology shit posting. For those that don't know, I'm Theo. I worked at Twitch for a while. I was there doing software engineering primarily for like video infra as well as the safety team. Hopped around though. I built ModView. I built a bunch of channel point stuff. I helped work on the dashboard, Twitch Studio, and a bunch of other things. Now I run a company called Ping. I can show you guys what we're doing now. Ping was built to make it as easy as possible. Oh, go run Spec. Thank you for dropping your audience here. I really appreciate it. I promise to do my best to not like de-weeb them. And yeah, hopefully you'll still get them back. Anyways, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I built Ping, which is a software tool for content creators to bring guests onto their show. You do a video call just like Google Meet or Zoom, but all on the web. Then you can copy paste people directly into OBS. I'm pretty sure Specs used it, not positive on that, but her friend Kisaka is one of our earliest users who's been using Ping forever. We also have awesome people like V Shoujo. They use our tech all of the time for almost all their collabs. We have Linus Tech Tips who uses it whenever they have guests call in now. Elgato was just live using us earlier today. We have lots of awesome people making crazy content using Ping. Really proud of what we built here. This is why I quit Twitch, to build tools like this. So yeah. Generally, I'm streaming. Yeah, Kisaka, love her to death. Really cool crew. Yo, Michael, good to have you here. But yeah, TLDR of this stream is I run a small company now, which means I don't have as much opportunity as I used to just talk shit about tech all of the time, like I was at Twitch and all my other gigs. So the stream's kind of an outlet for me to talk shit and do a bunch of code stuff, as well as just a way to be more familiar with streaming and the content creation problems that people experience every day. And believe me, it has helped a ton as we're building a content creator focused company. Like, it is hard to imagine that we would be building anything the right way right now if it wasn't for the amount of time I've spent streaming myself, especially over the last like 6 to 8 months. So yeah, great to have y'all here. Make sure you give me a follow and give us a follow on Twitter in particular. That is where I tend to shitpost the most. So if you want to see updates about what we're working on at Ping, hear me complain about web dev, JavaScript, backend, frontend, mobile, all that type of stuff too, or just complain about Twitch and like the things that I think they could be doing better, it's a good place to follow. Thank you guys all so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Anyways, back to bitching about this. So, where was I before the raid? There was like a good question or two. I think the issue, this is from Maple earlier. We were talking about how Remix doesn't have type safety, and it's a little frustrating that the Remix team doesn't embrace the things they do or don't do, or work with the community to better like understand them. So type safety is one of those things that I think Remix isn't doing enough of right now. Hot module reloading is another example of something like that. I get why they have the stance they have. I don't think that stance is correct, and they don't make it easy enough for me to work around it. They're almost upset with me for wanting it. Versus one thing I reference a lot, I wrote a blog post a few months ago because I was pissed that Next.js just doesn't solve this problem either. It doesn't. Next.js's type story is just as bad as Remix's. The difference is the primitives that are provided in Next are relatively easy to just treat like an express endpoint and build something else on top of. I've seen people start to do that in Remix, and I'm really excited to see where that all goes. But when we do things like this in Next.js land, we get a bunch of, like, how do I put it? We get a really positive response from the core team over at Vercel and from people who are contributing to Next.js and building these frameworks. I wrote this article because I think there are lessons to be learned there that Next.js could pull in at its core, and that we as developers can like really take advantage of and use to improve our full stack story and not run into errors as often on our like both in dev and in production. The problem with how Next does this is even though it owns the backend and the front end, it doesn't care to solve the bridge between the two. You can have your backend and front end in the same file. I even have an example here where we have a page file, id.ts. It should be tsx because it's returning JSX. But this is a page component that returns info that it fetches from DB. These two things are in the same file. We have a backend function and a front end like page that renders. This gets imported on client. This gets opted out. It is only done on server. And even though these two things are directly next to each other, this is any. This type is not communicated to this page, even though it's from right here. If you wanted, you can do an inference of the type. That's actually one of the things they recommend, the infer get server side props. This does some nasty shit. The first thing is it drops nulls everywhere. It just makes everything nullable. And it like working around that is obnoxious. It destroys the data structures with some of the weird like assertions it makes internally, and then drops any's everywhere else too. I hate this type, and it's sad because this should be the solution and it's just bad. And the get server side props like context is like something you also have to pass this directly in order for it to work at all. It was messy. And even then, if you put something like a date time in here, this is going to infer the type of date time, but that's going to come through as a string, not as a date time, because it's being turned into JSON between here and here. That means this is not a real contract we can honor. It is a lie. So our options are build a lie or don't infer anything and just write our own types on top. I think both of those are bad options. I really don't think that we should be doing, I even rant about how bad their default is, where it just overrides a bunch of shit with any's. It's so nasty. And yeah. What I recommend in here is TRPC, which I'm sure most of y'all have heard me rant about at this point. TLDR with TRPC is that you write a function in one place. So trpc.router.query, give it a name, you give it a Zod object for the input validator. This is important because this validates that you're passing what you expect on server. So if this validation fails, this API call fails. Very important because it allows the type safety to also be runtime safety and validate the requests when they're received. On the other side, you write a resolve function that can be async that returns some shit. Doesn't really matter what it returns because on the client, you type trpc.useQuery get user by ID, user ID : query.id. And I'm pulling that from, in this case, use router. This will now give you a type safe result through was effectively a fetch call going through React query that is then typed through the router itself directly, also validated through Zod if you're making a request that has like a validation of it on it. And arguably most importantly, how do I word this? It optionally uses a transformer like super JSON, which allows you to actually pass an object regardless of what's on it to the client. So I can put a date time in here. I can put a map in here. I can put all these data types, pretty much anything but a function. Even I think you can kind of do classes. It's a mess, but you technically can. This lets me pass a complete data structure. Basically anything I can fetch from Prisma, I can now pass to my client and have the Prisma type, because Prisma's very well typed, be honored all the way to my client where we're consuming it. So now, if I was to rename a field in DB, let's say I was rendering name here. So I'm rendering user.name. If I was to change this to username, I would get the type error on the client where we're rendering it because that type contract is being pushed all the way through. Yeah, I saw somebody ask you could put a type on both get server side props and in your component props. Yeah, you can. I have an example up here where you manually type everything. So you can manually type like the component expects user, but what if you modify server side props and you just select ID now, or you change your selection? This might still honor the contract and lie to the other side. If you assign the type on both, which you can do, you could put like the type definition, like both the server like function and the client page expect the same thing. However, what you don't get there is the ability to know that that type is true. With something like Prisma here, this is a pretty innocent looking option or like function. If this selected date time or created at, that type contract is a lie now. And there's no reason it has to be when we could transform the data or inline it in a like script tag that honors the contract. This doesn't need to be a lie, and it often is. Maple asked, could you combine TRPC with remix form and get progressive enhancement? Possibly. Generally, like a remix form is a method of posting. There's no reason you wouldn't be able to post to a TRPC endpoint. My only concern there would be that the shape of like a remix form is very much a traditional like form, whereas the shape of a TRPC post is often is using something like super JSON to encode data in some chaotic way. Yo, 10 gift subs from Smooth Operator. Thank you so much. I super appreciate that. To all the people who just got gifted subs, make sure you're in the Discord if you're not already, because you now have access to the sub-only channels where I post ping source code and just chat about whatever. So definitely take advantage of that if you're not already in the Discord. Hop in there. Thank you again, Smooth Operator, for the very generous gift, and I am pumped that we have 10 more people that get to hang out in the server like that. So yeah, if you're not a sub, you can still feel free to join the server. All you're missing is the sub-only channels where I post source code, and starting soon, probably more pictures of my cats. So yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Cool. Oh yeah. I definitely see a future where you could combine TRPC and remix form. My concern would be that like without JavaScript, if you did the progressive enhancement side, that the shape of that post might not honor the expected shape of the TRPC endpoint or things along those lines. There's a lib for type safe forms. Interesting. Remix forms.seasons.cc. Of course it's using Zod. So this is pretty much TRPC then. Like in the end, all TRPC is a Zod layer in front of a type safe, like a TypeScript function that takes in a certain input and returns an output. And then on client, you import the types so that when you compile, the backend code goes away, but when you're developing, you have those contracts to work against. The other cool thing you can do, I think we do this in the OSRG code base. So Open Source Raid Guild is a cool little project that Jacob runs for helping open source projects get a bunch of manpower for big things like rewriting all their tests from Jest to Vitest, moving over to TypeScript, stuff like that. I rebuilt their website a while back and used all the usual T3 stack stuff. One of the cool things we did here is we actually share the Zod validator here. So we have the contact form validator so that on the, can I link Discord? Yes, of course. There's also a command, !Discord. That'll link that directly. t3.gg/discord. Cool. So here I have a form validator, just a z.object where we expect email, you to select one of these roles, a message, and a repo URL. And I'm able to use this on the back end in the router, contact, index. The input is the contact form validator that I'm importing from shared. And on the front end, I think a lot of y'all see where this is going now. Component, it's not in components, it's in pages. Contact. In here, I import contact form validator. And the contact form validator is used in the React Hook Forms library, where you can pass a resolver, that in this case is the Zod resolver. This isn't smart enough to infer the type off this, so I also pass the type that is generated by Zod. But this now gives me a contract that is shared both by the backend and by the form that both can honor hydrate errors the same way and everything. It's so nice. If I was to do something like in the contact form validator, is this smart enough to link me there? It is not, so I will open that again. If I was to do a custom error in here where you can put like a custom .error message and pass a different string for what this should throw if you hit any of these cases, that's optional, but you can do it. And what will happen now is if somebody hits this as an API, that's the response they get from the server if they fail this check. Or if they're in the form, you'll actually get for each field a .error or error.field. So in here, we register role. You have options to select. And errors.role, if you select a role that's not valid, it will render this with the error role message. We have this for every field. If you put an invalid email, it will give you the error that the email is invalid. Can we pass Zod types to front end to use with example React Query? That's what TRPC is doing. So if you're interested in doing that, if you're using Zod for the backend and you want to use it you want to validate on the front end the same way, that's exactly how TRPC works. It is phenomenal for that in particular. Really excited to watch that Matt video about Zod. We'll definitely look for that in the future. Thanks for bringing that out, Kisor. Yeah. But as for passing the type, with Zod, it's actually kind of meant to run on client. It was built for that originally as like a form validator. A lot of people are using it now on server to validate. But as long as you define your whatever validator somewhere that both backend and front end can import, absolutely, both backend and front end can import it. You can use it wherever. This is effectively a function you call with an object, and it passes if your object honors what you described here, and it throws if you don't. It's very simple, and you can use it wherever. It's one of those like really powerful primitives that we can build so much stuff on top of. Zod, yep, Joy, they're all similar. The big difference with Zod is it's very, very focused on TypeScript, type safety, and type inference. Things like the z.infer type of contact form validator. This is so powerful. And other form validators are trying to add this in now, but most of them are just not as explicit a contract and don't have anywhere near as nice a syntax for defining something and then consuming it after. Also, shout out Bear Kobos and Dason Mixon for the subs as well. Really appreciate it, y'all. Yes, smooth operator. Instead of defining the type directly in TRPC, if you want to reuse the validator, you would define that externally because you can't, or in many reasons shouldn't import backend code directly in front end. You can import backend types in front end because types get compiled out, but Zod is a validator. This is actual code that runs. So I go out of my way when I'm going to reuse a validator to put it in a separate shared folder or package where both the front end and back end can consume it safely. But yes, you can't just import the validator from backend on front. I actually had to write some code to throw a nice error when people accidentally do that in our code base because it was a kind of common mistake where somebody would try and import a Zod validator from a file that also had a Prisma import. Surprisingly common. React final form hooks. Interesting. Might check that one out later. Sebastian Marquez likes Atomic CSS. Interesting. I really need a better story for moving things from my laptop to my desktop. From desktop to laptop, actually, because I screen share my laptop, even though I do most of my stuff on my desktop when I'm streaming. So that's not. There we are. Atomic CSS is surprisingly effective performance-wise if done well, which is why I'm all about it lately. It scales well by flattening out both in terms of the number of rules and incremental loading rules. Minimizes recalc of the whole doc. It allows for local scoping. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. I am very curious how this goes. Yeah, one point Maple made earlier I didn't have a good chance to address was that they really like how Remix can easily make their app work before JavaScript. Plus forms are basically declarative mutations. Yeah, totally agree. If the pages I built were just one form, and like honestly, like the OSRG site, this should probably be Remix, not not Next.js. If TRPC was better honored and something like that was more doable in Remix, I would excitedly port this over. But the site's a form, a homepage, off, and links to 3 other places. There's no reason for this to be on Next.js. It doesn't need it. Just realized it's starting to get a tiny bit late. I am down to keep chatting a bit more, but let's pick a good final topic before I wrap up. Do want to look into React final form hooks too. If I don't go over it now, I just want to have this like open in the background. React hooks to bind to final forms, high performance subscription based form management. Interesting. Very interesting. Kind of like this use field pattern where you can pass the form through, especially if that like is type safe throughout. This library will re-render your entire form on every change as you type. Grr. It might be smaller, but it's not more performant. That's sad. Gonna keep using React hook forms for now. Have I heard of Quick? Yes. Very interesting. I am excited to see more stuff about it. I know that Ryan did a good stream about it, or 2 actually. Yeah, Maple, that's a good suspicion. The thing to know about Quick is it's made by the same people who made or the same dude who made the original version of Angular, and I think it says a lot. Yeah. If you guys are more interested on Quick, Ryan is definitely the right person to watch. He had 2 separate streams where he talked about it. One where he built a website using it. He usually does a clone of Hacker News to see how performant he can make it with different web frameworks and solutions. He had a really cool one about Quick. He also did a stream with Misko, the creator of Angular and Quick, to chat all about like their philosophy around it. Yeah. You can really think of Quick as like Angular minus the the bloat. It's still the same mindset of solve every problem and build the like one solution that solves it, but it's trying to do such without all the weight. It's an interesting project. I am excited to see where it goes, but yeah. But I saw that Remix e-commerce demo and it has a 98 performance. Uh, uh, Lighthouse does not tell all. There's a lot of things that have really good Lighthouse scores that run like shit on most old Android phones. Like Lighthouse scores are cool. They're not all that you need to tell how fast something is or how well it works. And I really think Ryan is a good person to watch like the content of if you're curious about that. He's done a really good job of like comparing at a very low level like all of these frameworks and the decisions they made to get meaningful HTML to the user as fast as possible. And even crazy stuff like he was one of the first people to try out the Astro SSR stuff, and he used Solid.js to render the comments on server and on client so that they could hydrate on client and let you like click a button to collapse and load in more comments while still hydrating it with HTML almost instantaneously, and ended up getting performance numbers and like bundle size smaller on this Astro SSR build with like a bunch of like micro Solid.js imports than he could from almost anything else. And I'm really excited about that because, as I'm sure a lot of you know by now, I really don't like all-in-one solutions. I'm really interested in how things like Astro, things like Solid, things like React even try to solve specific problems really well so that they can assemble and be attached to other pieces to do cool shit. Astro is not competing with Remix so much as it's competing with, I often say Vite. It's building a solution in a place that allows it to be used for other things and by other like library creators just as much as everyday devs. Like you could build a new framework on top of Astro with their new SSR model, and that's super exciting. Definitely need to check out the new Ryan Florence talk from Reactathon. I should react to more of that content later. Getting a little bit tired. I woke up earlier than usual today, so I'm probably going to start wrapping it up, but next stream, that sounds like a good thing. I have a guest next week, right? Yes, I do. I have Jason Dockton coming on next week. For those who don't know, Lighthouse performance is more important when you're a smaller company. Interesting take. Yeah. Lighthouse performance means a lot of different things, sadly. But yeah, next week we have Jason from URAD. For those that don't know, URAD is an awesome charity focused on helping like mostly gamers, but an increasingly wide group of people get mental health help and access to therapy that otherwise might not have access. If you have money, they'll help you find a therapist. If you don't have money, they'll help you get what you need to get a therapist. They're a phenomenal group. Support them as much as I can, help them a little bit with the website, but it's honestly mostly Jason's work. The reason I'm bringing Jason on is because in August of last year, he realized Squarespace wasn't the right platform to build his charity on. So he taught himself to code from scratch and ended up pretty much on the T3 stack. He used a Supabase instead of Planet Scale, and he didn't use TypeScript just yet. But beyond that, was pretty much using all of our tech. So I helped him adopt tRPC and TypeScript, and yeah, we chat a ton now. In 3 months, he became one of my favorite developers to work with and chat with. And what I'm excited about for this talk is the way he thinks about learning. He has a fundamentally, like, I think, like a groundbreaking approach to how you pick up and learn from new information. He described it as applied wisdom, where you take a step back and figure out, why did this person share this? Why did these things benefit them? And do their reasons line up with mine? I'm really excited for this talk. It's actually going to be one of like, there are a few I've been more hyped for than this. Jason's dope. Can't wait to have this show next week. So make sure you're here for that next week. Probably still 3 p.m. I'll post an update if we decide to go earlier. So make sure you're here for that next week. Might do a stream this weekend. Probably not. I'm in total chaos. But if there's any big news I want to chat about, might go live again. Also, keep an eye on the YouTube channel. I have one more fun video coming out tomorrow. Not related to any of the tech stuff, but if you like me, I think you'll enjoy the video. It's pretty goofy. My team bullies me. Anyways, let's go find someone to raid. Let's find someone to raid. Hopefully Otto's still alive. That would be a fun place to throw y'all. Looks like Otto is offline. Not that surprised. Let's go through the category. Software dev. Viewers high to low. Oh, cool. We're pretty high up there. Ooh, what's Leah working on? JavaScript. Good sign. Learning React. Y'all want to go help poor Leah learn React? Whenever you Google that, you're going to get 3 articles from 3 different eras that have contradicting information. Please don't like backseat too hard. If I send y'all here, be like kind with the suggestions you make. Yeah, be good. Don't annoy anybody. Don't be assholes. But make sure that poor Leah starts on the right foot. Cool. Raid starting now. See you guys over there. Thank you so much. Oh, make sure she doesn't use Create React App. That much you can do for me. That much you can backseat a bit for. Cool. Hitting that raid now button. See you guys there. I'm gonna head off. Y'all YouTubers, thanks for stopping by.